There probably aren't a lot of things that can scare a cold-blooded, egomaniacal Russian dictator like Putin, but there are some. COVID-19, for instance. The guy's terrified of it and makes his staff take PCR tests several times a day, every day. Then there's assassins, independent media, democratic elections, and democracy in general. The probability of being overthrown by his own people, and Finland. Wait, what? Finland? Yep. The happiest country in the world with around 75% forest surface and the world's biggest archipelago absolutely terrifies the current head of the Russian Federation. Here's why. Imagine for a moment you're a Russian resident in the port city of St. Petersburg, north of Moscow on the Baltic Sea. It's the year 2023, and you turn on the television to discover that once neutral Finland, your neighbor to the north, is now a part of the NATO alliance. It's a shocking blow, if only because you know exactly what it means for you and your family. Putin has been fuming about Western imperial expansion for months now. And as things have gotten worse in Ukraine, you fear it's only a matter of time before you or someone you know is conscripted and sent to the front lines as cannon fodder. The way the propagandists have been talking about Finland's defection to the West and Russia's Baltic access being restricted by NATO nations, you worry that Ukraine is just the start of a decade of war that will inevitably end on your doorstep. Finland is, after all, less than 125 miles from St. Petersburg, well within range of Western long-range guided missiles now being deployed over the border. You get goosebumps as a chill runs down your spine. The future, as long as Putin is in power, looks very dark indeed. It is a fitting twist of fate that the man who set out to reduce Ukraine to a puppet state and create a greater buffer between Russia and NATO has now induced long-neutral Scandinavian countries to apply, and in Finland's case, join the NATO alliance, and adding insult to injury, double its physical border with Europe. During the Cold War, neutral Finland had to be in line with Russia. Fearful of reprisal and repression, it will do so no longer. Now bolstered by its Western allies, Finland offers undeniable physical, material, and technological benefits to NATO, and that should scare Putin. If the invasion of Ukraine tells us one thing about Putin, it's that he cannot conscience the prospect of ex-Soviet satellites drifting into Western orbit. Back in 2014, when the war in Ukraine really started, Ukraine was already on this path. A presidential coup had deposed its leader, and quickly Ukraine's very constitution was amended to include a clause saying that the country would immediately strive to meet qualifications for eventual NATO membership. There's a reason for Putin's paranoia. Russia hasn't exactly been on the happy side of history for much of its past. European invaders have picked Russia apart, or tried to at least, at various times, from Napoleon's aborted invasion in 1812 to grueling battles with Germany in both world wars. Putin's heroes, the post-1945 leaders he so desperately seeks to emulate, laid down a strict national security policy during the Cold War that eventually became Soviet doctrine. Rather than sit idly while countries on its frontiers flirted with Western influence, Russia would incorporate them into its own ideological bloc, spanning Eastern Europe. The buffer it created with the Warsaw Pact is still cited by Putin and his propagandists as necessary for Russian independence. Without it, Russia allegedly becomes susceptible to Western invasion. And if you can't see the irony there, you won't see it anywhere. The geography of the Russian frontier plays an important role in this strategic outlook, and is thus relevant to our discussion today. Eastern Europe offers far fewer natural defensive barriers than elsewhere, like say the mountainous borders between Austria and Italy. As industrialization transformed the face of war in the 20th century, Russia had to reckon with the advent of modern, mechanized forces and armor. In World War II, German advances over the Eurasian steppes covered dozens, even hundreds of miles a day, stemmed only at a massive cost to Soviet manpower pools. Russia has benefited from Finnish neutrality since 1945 for many reasons, but paramount among them is the idea that it simply did not have to worry about the hostilities spilling out across its massive border in a hypothetical confrontation with NATO. That until today would most likely be confined to a small sliver of Baltic territory. No longer. When Finland officially joined NATO in 2023, Russia's border with the alliance effectively doubled. It now has 830 miles of difficult-to-patrol tundra, swamps, forests, and flatlands to worry about. Putin's defensive calculus was altered overnight. He may pretend Finland's accession doesn't bother him, but it does. As Putin told the Finnish Prime Minister in 2022, "When we look across the border now, we see a Finn on the other side. If Finland joins NATO, we will see an enemy." Strategically, Russia simply lacks the troops to handle this frontier, since they've deployed most of their available forces in Ukraine. It's a bear of a problem to deal with, one that simultaneously shrinks Putin's sphere of influence and makes his imperial ambition even harder to achieve. NATO 1, Russia 0. The Kremlin's time-tested tactic to place the onus of aggression on its enemies is one it will continue using, portraying NATO enlargement as the cause of its actions, not the consequence. These rhetorical gymnastics are predictable enough. Now that Finland has joined NATO, democratically, we should note, something the Kremlin will not, Putin can use it as the cornerstone of his hateful crusade in Ukraine, a symptom of broader Western challenges to Russian interests everywhere. Putin has sworn that there will be consequences from Finnish and Swedish membership. That threat just doesn't cause the same alarm bells to ring today as it might have when it was issued, but NATO will still take it seriously. Just because Russia may lack the military means to make Finland pay, doesn't mean it will stop talking about it anytime soon. The same goes for Finland. These two countries have a past, and let's just say they could never really play nice. You see, there is real enmity between both countries, one that is historically rooted in shared 20th century experiences. Russo-Finnish animosity originated in Finland's membership as part of the Russian Empire until its independence in 1917, when the Tsarist government collapsed. Throughout the 1920s, Finland tried to retain its neutrality, backing out of a last-minute defense alliance with Poland, Latvia and Lithuania at the last minute. In 1932, the Soviets tried to quell Finnish fears by signing their own non-aggression pact. Little did Finland know the Soviets would dole out non-aggression pacts like hotcakes in the coming conflict, treating bilateral promises as loose suggestions rather than binding rules. During World War II, tensions between the Soviet Union and Finland exploded once more when the Soviets signaled their expansionist aims by signing yet another non-aggression pact, this time with Nazi Germany in August 1939. This was the one that stunned the world, starting a global war that would consume the globe. As a result, the sovereign state of Poland ceased to exist, and Soviet leaders set their sights on the next target, the Karelian Isthmus and the border of Finland, just west of Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. It didn't take much by way of negotiation for the Soviets to launch an armored blitz over the Finnish border on November 30th, 1939, kickstarting the Russo-Finnish War, or Winter War. The Finnish response to an invasion of 1 million men is the stuff of legend, one whose indomitable courage and resilience have been likened to Ukrainian resolve in its existential crisis against Russia today. As winter set on the Finnish frontier, plucky Finnish ski troops offered stout resistance, inflicting massive casualties on the bogged-down Red Army. Ultimately, though the Finns, lacking any Western assistance whatsoever from Britain and France, proved unable to stop the Soviets from reaching Vyborg in 1940. The invasion taught Soviet leaders it could neither conquer nor govern a territory that size with the forces at hand. The Winter War resulted in Finnish territorial losses, but the Finns avoided a worse fate. It would take a Machiavellian alliance with Germany to push the Soviets out in 1941, and an armistice in 1944 to forever seal Finland's rancor towards its aggressive neighbor. Finland's strict policy of neutrality it had held since 1945 changed overnight with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, Finland has simply had enough. Its armed forces stand ready to take up arms with their NATO counterparts to deter any future Russian threat, recognizing, as we all should, that over the long term, Russia will reconstitute its forces to adapt its force posture to NATO's new Scandinavian presence from the Baltic to the Arctic. Some are calling Finland's NATO membership the biggest development in European security since the remilitarization of Germany in 1955, when Germany came into NATO as a remilitarized state after the Second World War. This begs the question of why. What does Finland offer NATO in terms of immediate military capacity that other states might not? The first is proximity. NATO is now within touching distance of the strategically important Kola Peninsula in Russia's far north and its second largest city, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic Sea coast. The Kola Peninsula, in case you don't know, has been described by the Center for Strategic and International Studies as the crux of Russia's military establishment in the Western Arctic, whose air and maritime capabilities are essential to Russia's homeland defense, Arctic dominance, and global power. Its Severomorsk 1 airbase, Gadzhievo submarine base, and Okolnaya submarine support base on the peninsula provide Russia with operational readiness in the Arctic, where it can deploy SLBM, ICBM, and electronic warfare assets to defend its positions at a moment's notice. Russia's aggression thus far has resulted in a greater concentration of NATO forces on its Baltic border, a trend it can expect to see continue further north if it continues behaving badly in the geopolitical realm. Starting in 2017, NATO deployed 4 multinational battle groups to the region, one in Estonia, one in Latvia, one in Lithuania, and one in Poland. Each contains about a battalion's worth of forces, just over 1,000 soldiers, together with their equipment, tanks, tactical armored vehicles, a headquarters company, logistics infrastructure, and everything else they would need to fight. NATO cycles new forces through each battle group on a rotational basis. After the 2022 invasion, NATO members agreed to deploy 4 additional battle groups to the states adjoining Ukraine, a safeguard in case the conflict spilled over into NATO territory. Collectively, the establishment of these 4 units constituted NATO's biggest regional reinforcement in over a generation. Fortunately, it has not, yet. But as of today, NATO has deployed multinational battle groups to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, extending its defensive front with Russia from the Black Sea to the Baltic. Finland's membership takes NATO's forward presence all the way north to the Arctic Sea. NATO's multinational battle groups are combined arms formations, meaning they employ infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in tandem to achieve their objectives. These unique units are extremely mobile, adaptable, and flexible, trained for an array of threats and combat scenarios. The headquarters for each battle group is integrated, meaning each nation is represented at the command post. Together, they bring unique capabilities to the table in order to bolster collective defense. According to one NATO official, these flexible units are mutually supporting and, most importantly, send a message that we're here, we're ready, and we can respond to any aggression. It's now time to get down to brass tacks. What does Finland offer NATO? Finland has a relatively small peacetime military, ranked 51 out of 145 countries by the annual Global Firepower Review. It spends about $6 billion annually on its standing armed forces. The Finnish army, the country's largest branch and one devoted to the defense of the nation, has a cohort of around 23,000 active duty soldiers on its rolls, including active duty professionals and conscripts. This may not seem like much, but it has a reserve potential of 900,000 from which it can draw 280,000 well-equipped soldiers in times of crisis, 3 times more than the British Army can field. These are subject to mandatory military service and regular training exercises, meaning its reserves are also prepared well. In terms of armored vehicles, Finland's primary tank platform is the highly effective German-produced Leopard 2A4 and 2A6 tanks, of which Finland boasts somewhere in the region of 200, 100 acquired from the Netherlands. 179 of these are said to be field-ready. It recently donated 3 Leopards to Ukraine. Apart from its tank force, Finland fields an assortment of infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, with over 200 of the former and 1,000 of the latter. One of Finland's greatest strengths is its army artillery, considered by some to be the largest and best equipped Europe has to offer. Among more than 900 artillery pieces, it uses the Korean K9 Thunder self-propelled howitzer, the 155 K98 towed howitzer, and M270 multiple launch rocket system, or MLRS, built by the United States. It also has over 700 heavy mortars, 18 Amos self-propelled mortars, 34 2S1 Gvozdika self-propelled howitzers, 471 light howitzers, and 76 130mm field guns. This is a lot of firepower, part of Finland's plan to have the most firepower in Europe by some margin. This service makes use of counter-battery radars to locate the position of enemy artillery batteries, sometimes giving Finnish troops enough alert to bug out before they are struck. Its wheeled counterparts to the devastating American HIMARS systems have already been wreaking havoc on Russian forces in Ukraine. It has been said that the Finnish artillery has more artillery firepower than the combined militaries of Poland, Germany, Norway, and Sweden can muster. The country offers one of the premier artillery firing training areas in the world, Rovajärvi in northern Finland. One comment on an article covering Finland's artillery capabilities stuck out. As someone who did his military service in a forward observer team, the commenter notes, "I am very jealous of Finnish artillery. Even if a lot of systems are old, quantity has a quality all of its own, and that goes double for artillery." The Wilson Center has noted that one of Finland's assets is its well-equipped civilian defense infrastructure, which can be rapidly mobilized to assist in times of crisis or war. This is called the Civilian Total Defense, an organization that would rush to ensure the nation has enough food, fuel reserves, bomb shelters, and protection for 6 months in the event of an attack. This, as you might expect, was created as a direct consequence of repelling the Soviet Union's full-scale invasion in the 1940s, and the country's strategic stockpiles showed their utility when Finland tapped into them during the COVID-19 pandemic. Finland is a technologically advanced nation with a host of industrial-grade IT capabilities, including 5G communications and cybersecurity. This means that Finland's membership automatically conferred NATO with Nokia's entire regional network of 5G infrastructure, a major boom in an era of increasing cyber competition. Finland, relative to many other countries, is resilient to digital attacks, currently ranked 11th in the Cybersecurity Index. It is a telecommunications and intelligence powerhouse, which NATO will reap the rewards from for years to come. Finland's accession to NATO has essentially turned the once contested Baltic Sea into a NATO lake. All of its coastal states are now a part of NATO. If Sweden can follow in Finland's footsteps, which many are optimistic it can, for the first time since the abolition of the Kalmar Union in 1523, the Wilson Center study observes, all the Nordics will be members of the same military alliance. From a military strategy perspective, the additional geographical depth that Finland and Sweden create for regional defense is extremely valuable for all the Nordic countries, as well as for the Baltics. The extension of NATO firepower extends to other domains. Finland has a fleet of 55 US-made Fa-18 Hornets, fully equipped with an arsenal of American precision-guided munitions, among them the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AGM-158 JASSM air-to-ground cruise missile. In 2022, Finland announced it will station 64 newly acquired F-35 stealth fighters in Lapland starting in 2026. These will be entirely operational by 2030. Their presence makes them interoperable with NATO's existing Baltic Sea air defense missions, and we predict NATO will further extend these missions into Finland on the basis of its existing Baltic air policing operation. In terms of naval power, Finland has the 12th largest navy in the world, with a fleet including 8 missile boats and 10 minesweepers that will come in handy as part of NATO task forces operating within the Baltic. Fortunately for NATO, Finland already spends more than 2% of its GDP on defense, a number that will only rise now that it has become a bulwark of Western security. Finland is not one to shirk its defense responsibilities. Combining its artillery with highly specialized mobile light infantry units, it will wreak havoc on a much larger invading force and make its ancestors proud. By now, we're pretty sure we've made our point. Finland is a military power not to be messed with. What will Putin do? It's unclear whether Russia has the strategic or economic bandwidth to adequately deal with the security complications posed by Finland's NATO membership. Even without NATO, Finland would pose a serious adversary. NATO has military bases throughout Europe. It still must secure Finnish political agreement to permanently base its forces on the Russian border, but NATO will increasingly be looking to simulate the harsh conditions of Northern Europe in its wargaming exercises. Finland has been rehearsing and training its forces to operate in this environment for decades. Now, at the minimum, it will teach allied forces to do the same. Russia's strategic conundrum is enormous. If it had sat back for a decade or more, there's a chance NATO would have dissolved on its own, its internal unity torn asunder by petty politics and an overall lack of purpose. Now Russia will have to make a choice on how to engage in the Baltic-Arctic region. It will likely do what it always has, resort to grey zone tactics to undermine NATO's position. This hybrid spectrum includes attacks on infrastructure like undersea cables, pipelines, and oil and gas fields, or targeted assassinations, sponsored acts of terrorism, and cyber attacks. It will always fall back on its beloved nuclear arsenal, saber-rattling where it needs to project its rapidly diminishing strength. The long bottom line is that Russia can't do much until it pulls out of Ukraine. As the author of a recent Finnish defense report concludes, while Russia will likely try to beef up its forces near Finland in the near future, these won't come anywhere near Cold War levels. Due to the losses Russia has suffered in Ukraine and the slowness of establishing new forces, the report concludes, it is likely that there will be no significant increase in military power in Finland's immediate neighborhood before the 2030s. And that should give Putin great pause. But will it? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. What would happen if Russia attacked the United States? In this video, we'll take a look at hypothetical battle scenarios between the two countries and what their outcome might be. We will assume a one-on-one contest with minimal NATO involvement. We will also assume that the conflict remains conventional. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many American national security experts were weary of its military buildup under Putin. The Russian military repeatedly boasted about its modern arsenal on the land, the seas, the skies, and even in space. In everything from its T-14 Armata tank to the S-550 satellite-killing missile, and even its Belgorod Doomsday submarine, Russia was supposedly building a fighting force to rival the best the West had to offer. Then the war happened and most of these claims didn't materialize. Instead, it became a war like many of Russia's other conflicts throughout history: long, bloody, and attritional. The likeliest conflict between the United States and Russia would occur in Eastern Europe. The United States currently has about 65,000 troops stationed in Europe. However, most of these are not stationed in Eastern Europe. About 35,000 of them are in Germany. An additional 12,000 are in Italy, and about 10,000 are in the United Kingdom. The others are mostly divided between other countries in Western Europe. This deployment structure is a legacy of NATO's Cold War dispositions. Only a few hundred of the American forces in Europe are close to the Eastern European front, where the war would take place. None are in the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which Vladimir Putin has long desired to bring back into Russia's orbit. This means that in the immediate term, at least, Russia will have great numerical superiority in men and material. Although Russia has repeatedly proven itself less than effective against modern Western equipment, the combination of numerical superiority and a narrow front along the Baltic, where the likeliest confrontation would take place, would give Russia the advantage in the initial offensive, even if Moscow's military takes disproportionate casualties, which we should come to expect by now. The United States Department of Defense acknowledges the initial disadvantage that American and NATO forces would face in a scenario where Russia invades the Baltic states. There are programs in place to help mitigate this disadvantage, such as Rapid Raptor, which began in 2014. This program is designed to surge the F-22 Raptor to hotspots where it's most needed. Because there are only 187 of them, and even fewer fit for combat at a given moment, the F-22 fleet is stretched thin. Though the Air Force plans to begin the sunset of the F-22 Raptor in 2030 in favor of the 6th generation, Next Generation Air Dominance (NGAD) fighter, it remains the world's premier air superiority fighter jet for now. With this in mind, the Rapid Raptor program is designed to quickly deploy a package of F-22s and the necessary logistical support to any hotspot in the world, and to have the aircraft ready for combat within 24 hours. To do this, the Rapid Raptor program uses the C-17 Globemaster III transit aircraft to support the necessary arrangements for at least 4 F-22 Raptors. The Air Force would certainly invoke the Rapid Raptor program in a hypothetical confrontation with Russia in Europe. In April 2023, the Air Force announced that F-22s from the 94th Fighter Squadron would be arriving in Poland. These fighters and the supporting Raptors would swing into action, and although they would not be able to halt the invasion on their own, they would be at the tip of the spear of America's combat aircraft in Europe, which would also take part in operations to reclaim the skies over the war zone from the Russians. These aircraft would include F-35s, which have been deployed to Europe since 2017. The first permanent American F-35 base in Europe came in the fall of 2021 at RAF Lakenheath in England. There may be as many as 430 F-35 fighters in Europe by 2030, although not all of them would be United States aircraft. Either way, American F-35s are and will be a formidable force facing the Russians. Russia has the world's second largest number of total military aircraft at 4,173 as of 2022. The Russian Air Force is also the world's second largest, with 3,863 aircraft. The United States Air Force has 5,217 aircraft, and America has a total of over 13,000 aircraft in its combined fleet. However, the disparity would not be as dramatic as this in a European conflict, because many of America's aircraft are deployed around the world. With China increasingly menacing the Indo-Pacific region, the United States would still not be able to concentrate as much as it wanted, even if it found itself fighting Russia in Europe. In contrast, Russia would be able to concentrate nearly all of its forces around the war zone. However, that doesn't mean things would go great for Moscow. As we've seen in Ukraine, Russia is reluctant to deploy its air force in full-scale combat operations. That's a luxury that it would not be able to afford in a confrontation with the United States. Although Russia would theoretically have numbers, the USAF has better planes and better pilots. Most interestingly, a battle over the skies of Eastern Europe would bring Russia's Su-57 Felon into contact with the F-22 and F-35. The Kremlin has been famously reluctant to deploy its latest fighter over the skies of Ukraine, where it has been used in the war. It's only been in long-range support roles over Russian airspace. Russia would not have that option against the United States. Russia advertises the Su-57 as a fifth-generation fighter, although many experts disagree. Of the 4 operational fifth-generation fighters in the world, experts regard the Su-57 as the least stealthy. There are also even fewer of them than the F-22. There may be as few as 10 in Russia's active fleet. In 2021, Russian state media reported that the number would increase to 22 in the following year, with a planned total of 76 by 2028. The Su-57 has some reportedly impressive features, such as 3D thrust vectoring, which would make it more formidable in a dogfight. Although this ability would pose a challenge to the fourth-generation fighters still in service, most experts do not believe that the Felon would be capable of withstanding a battle with the F-22 Raptor, especially with the situational awareness that supporting F-35s would provide. With the F-22 and F-35 leading the charge, it's almost certainly only a matter of time before the United States would establish air superiority over the skies of Europe, even with fewer aircraft, although Russian air defense systems would be a constant threat. On the ground, things might be a little harder for America. Although the Russian army has proven incompetent in its ability to carry out well-coordinated offensives, it has proven surprisingly survivable and adaptable in the face of new weapons and tactics. For example, at the start of the war, the Russians' drone capability was limited. At first, Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones under the control of Ukrainian operators wreaked havoc on Russian armored columns and supply lines. Afterward, Ukrainian drone operators used smaller, loitering munitions and first-person view drones to great effect against their Russian opponents. Russia has adapted to these new tactics, however, first with kamikaze Iranian Shahed drones, and then with cheap FPV drones of their own. Now some war observers are noting that the Russians are beginning to gain a drone advantage over the Ukrainians. These FPV drones are plentiful and can destroy much more expensive systems. Russia is also now more careful about where it places its critical military infrastructure, such as command and control centers and fuel or supply depots, adapting to the Ukrainian HIMARS attacks from 2022. Both of these things could prove to be a problem for the United States in a confrontation with Russia in Europe, especially if the fight is contained to a narrower front, where the Russian forces, which would likely still outnumber their American opponents on the continent, could concentrate defenses, troops, artillery, and drones, which can destroy the expensive equipment the United States military depends on. However, the United States would bring much more formidable weapons to the conflict than that seen in use against the Russians by their Ukrainian enemies. For example, in December 2023, the United States took its first delivery of the Precision Strike missile, the intended replacement for the ATACMS, which Putin has explicitly mentioned as a destabilizing force in Ukraine. This ballistic missile has a range of 500 kilometers and can be launched from HIMARS, making it mobile and easy to conceal. The United States also has a stockpile of 300-kilometer ATACMS missiles, which it would deploy in a European conflict with Russia. These missiles would reach Russian military bases and infrastructure, as they are currently deployed in Ukraine, and force them even further back from the front, compounding communications and logistical problems for Russian forces. While these problems have not been fatal to the Russian cause in Ukraine, the Ukrainians also do not have air superiority like the United States almost certainly would have. The combination of air support and long-range missile attacks would almost certainly take a terrible toll on Russian supply lines, command infrastructure, and battlefield defenses. If the front in Europe is a long one that stretches from the Baltic to Ukraine, Russian defenses would be less concentrated and more at a disadvantage against American air and artillery power. American forces would likely concentrate in one sector and break through in armored drives with air and artillery support. The American Abrams tank has proven to be far more survivable than Russian main battle tanks like the T-72, T-80, and T-90. These tanks are prone to so-called jack-in-the-box explosions because their ammunition magazines are stored in the turret. In contrast, the Abrams stores its ammunition in a protected compartment, usually leaving only one shell exposed in the turret at any given time. This is why the Abrams and other Western tanks have tended to be damaged more often than destroyed in firefights with their Russian opponents. Meanwhile, the Russians have few T-14 tanks in service. the tank has not been deployed to Ukraine at all. The conclusion is hard to escape. Although war is always unpredictable, the likeliest outcome for a confrontation in Europe is that Russia would have some success in the early going, but as superior American forces deploy to the battlefield in larger numbers, the tide would reverse. Russia could do damage with its hard-acquired experience in drone warfare, targeting important American infrastructure and expensive systems, but Russian soldiers and equipment would have a hard time standing their ground against better organized, trained, and led American forces with superior equipment and formidable air and artillery support. Russia might be able to delay this outcome, but not prevent it. What would happen in an even more outlandish scenario? Could Russia launch a non-nuclear attack on the American homeland? Under the protection of two vast oceans, the United States is blessed with geographical shields that make Red Dawn scenarios all but impossible. It does, however, share a maritime border with Russia in Alaska. At its narrowest point in the Diomede Islands in the Bering Strait, the distance between American and Russian territory is only 2.4 miles. The Bering Strait itself is 51 miles. There is precedent for a foreign attack on Alaska. In World War II, the Japanese landed on the Aleutian Islands. They occupied Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians and were eventually expelled after a minor campaign lasting from 1942 to 1943. The likeliest and only remotely realistic attack on American soil by Russia would come across the Bering Strait and onto the Alaskan mainland. These attacks would be led by Russian special operations forces like the Spetsnaz and Marine units. It's unclear what objective they would be aiming at in this sparsely populated area. The three American military bases in Alaska, Fort Greely, Fort Wainwright, and Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, are located too far away from the Bering Strait, and any Russian operation would be detected before it could reach them. But since this is just for fun, let's assume that there's an unknown objective that the Russian drive is going after. The deployment of the Spetsnaz, which would lead this operation in the American homeland, would likely bring them into confrontation with American special operations units like the Navy SEALs or Green Berets, at last igniting a real-world confrontation that would solve an age-old debate, one which has featured as episodes on popular shows like Deadliest Warrior and Ultimate Soldier Challenge. The Russian Spetsnaz are still shrouded in some mystery, which adds to their mystique. The term Spetsnaz does not refer to any single unit, but is rather a collective label to describe Russian special operators in general. Spetsnaz spans the Navy, Air Force, and intelligence like the FSB. In one of the more unusual operations of modern times, American and Russian forces were acting as allies in the Balkans in the 1990s and early 2000s. Mark Jaconia was a Green Beret patrolling the Kosovo-Serbia border alongside Spetsnaz forces in 2001, with the mission of disrupting the movements of Albanian UCP-MB rebels. After they captured a prisoner, they found the location of a rebel base. The Spetsnaz stormed the base, while the Green Berets provided suppressive fire. This was the only operation where American and Russian special forces cooperated together. Jacona, the American team leader, described his Russian counterparts as having great intuition and instincts in combat, keen on tactics, could shoot well, took care of their weapons and equipment, and were in great shape, and were very well disciplined. He had respect for these badasses in spirit. Things might be different now. Sensitive documents leaked on the Discord platform in April 2023 revealed that Spetsnaz forces had suffered severely in Ukraine, according to American intelligence sources. These documents showed that Spetsnaz forces had been employed in direct combat by Russian officers who were skeptical about their conventional troops' ability. The result has supposedly not been pretty, with the Spetsnaz suffering heavy casualties. Satellite pictures of Spetsnaz facilities seem to reveal this depletion of forces. Spetsnaz units require at least 4 years of training, according to the American documents, and it could take Russia at least a decade to reconstitute its Spetsnaz forces to their level of pre-war operational acumen. If a hypothetical confrontation were to take place between American and Russian special operation forces in the near future, the latter would likely still be suffering from the experience in Ukraine, facing more experienced enemies operating in their home territory. Russian special operators deployed in Ukraine have also been poorly supported by conventional forces. This was only one of many examples of the Russian military failing to adequately use all the parts of its armed forces in a comprehensive approach to warfare. With the greater distance involved and operations against a much more sophisticated enemy than the Ukrainian military, it's hard to see how even Russia's best troops would operate adequately in an attack against American territory. Getting special operations forces across the Bering Strait without notice would be challenging enough. but getting the necessary armor, artillery, and air support would be a steep mountain to climb. Such movements would be spotted by satellite surveillance, making it almost impossible for Russia to conceal the movement of troops and equipment it would need to carry out an operation as ambitious as an invasion of American territory. But again, since this is a fictional scenario, let's assume that well-supported Spetsnaz forces succeeded in attacking the American homeland and get the necessary support they need to open a corridor into Alaska. Since most American forces are not concentrated in this remote area, the initial drive might find success and retake some or much of the territory that Russia sold off in 1867. Russian logistics would need to continue to support the drive. Russia has already demonstrated that this is a challenge in its own backyard, which raises questions about its ability to get supplies and equipment across the Bering Strait and into American territory on a sustained basis. The scenario would likely play out similarly as in Europe, except that Russia would not be able to bring the same numbers to bear in Alaska as on the European continent. If nothing else, the United States Navy and Air Force would prevent any more crossings. Carrier groups would soon move northward to support American operations. Russia would have a huge disadvantage here. It only has one aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, and this ship has been in dry dock for repairs for years. The Russians claim that the repairs will be complete in 2024 or 2025 at the latest, but either way, it's only one carrier against the multiple carriers and hundreds of planes that the United States would bring to bear in a defense of its homeland. After initial elements of the Russian forces land, the Russians would need to establish an air and naval presence to support the movement of troops across the Bering Strait. The Russian Navy has a median hull age of 30 years. The United States Navy has a median hull age of 23.3 years. Although this is a difference of only 7 years, the devil is in the details. There are only 21 amphibious assault ships in the Russian Navy, and only 2 of them are new, the Ivan Gren and Peter Morganov. The others are over 30 years old. The United States Navy, on the other hand, has 33 amphibious assault ships. Only 11 of these are over 30 years old. Russia has an advantage in corvettes, with 83 of them, while the US Navy's 21 corvettes are the disastrous Freedom and Independence class littoral combat ships. Even so, the US Navy has a much more modern fleet of 70 destroyers compared to the Russians' outdated fleet of 12. In submarines, the contest is less unequal. The United States has 68 submarines to Russia's 58, and some of the former's fleet will have global commitments. Many of the submarines in both countries' fleets are decades old, with a mixture of more modern submarines. If Russia can use its submarine fleet effectively, it could do some damage. However, some of Russia's submarines are diesel-electric powered, meaning that its fleet cannot run as quietly for as long as the US Navy submarine fleet can. And given the Russian military's history of being unable to combine its units together in a comprehensive set of operations, the US Navy should have the advantage, especially with greater surface ship and air power. Unable to support the invasion force in the sea or skies, it's only a matter of time before American reinforcements throw the invaders back. The original Red Dawn in 1984, which featured a conventional Soviet invasion of the United States through Alaska, was a modest box office success at the time, but became a cultural classic. The premise is far more absurd today. Although it's interesting to think about a Russian invasion of the United States for entertainment purposes, it's entirely impractical to manifest in reality. In a far likelier scenario, involving a dispute over Eastern Europe, Russia had always relied on its local numerical superiority. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, this would not be nearly as pronounced as it had been in the Cold War, even without NATO support, and Russia would be hard-pressed against the superior American troops and equipment that eventually make their way to the battlefield. If the preview in Ukraine is anything to go by, a full-scale non-nuclear confrontation would go very badly for Moscow, which would increase the incentive to use nuclear weapons. Let's be thankful that so far, nuclear deterrence has kept the American and Russian militaries from having a head-on collision. But what do you think? What would potential encounters between the US and Russian militaries look like? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. When Putin invaded Ukraine, he also decided to cut Russia off from most of the world. Big mistake. 17 months into the war that was supposed to end in a few days, Russia is now the most sanctioned country on the planet. The sanctions on it exceed even those placed on Iran and North Korea, and many of Russia's supposed besties aren't too keen on coming to its defense, even China. One of Russia's few allies is Belarus, But what if this relationship is not as close as Putin imagines? Could Belarus even decide to use nuclear weapons as a means of leverage against its larger neighbor? Let's take a look at the tangled relationship between Russia and Belarus, starting with Belarus's involvement in the Wagner Rebellion. When Belarus intervened in the Wagner Rebellion in Russia at the end of June, its authoritarian ruler, President Alexander Lukashenko, diffused the situation when he offered to host Wagner's mutinous leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, at his capital in Minsk. Prigozhin accepted and began a very short-lived exile there, ending the rebellion. Prigozhin has supposedly left Belarus as of July 10th, but Lukashenko's intervention in the Wagner Rebellion shows the extent to which Russian and Belarusian politics are intertwined. Belarus was also in the news at the beginning of the war, when Russian troops used its territory as a staging point for their failed attack on Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. Belarus was also one of only a handful of countries to vote against a United Nations resolution which condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, something that even China did not do. It rather abstained from voting either way. Instead, Belarus voted against the condemnation and blamed NATO for the war. The moves earned Belarus new sanctions and further distrust by the international community. This distrust built on very recent history. Belarus's presidential election of 2020 was widely regarded by international observers as being corrupt rather than free and fair. The United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the European Union all refused to recognize Alexander Lukashenko as the winner of the election, and therefore the legitimate president of Belarus. For Lukashenko, though, the election was standard operating procedure. He even once referred to himself as the last dictator in Europe in a 2012 interview with Reuters, though he tried to distance himself from the negative implications of that word, saying he is not a bad person at all. International observers have regarded all of Belarus's elections since 1994 as being neither free nor fair. Lukashenko's relationship with Vladimir Putin has always been politically and personally close. Lukashenko depends on Putin's support to remain in power, and Belarus is essentially a client state for the Russian Federation. The protests in 2020 which followed the controversial election only strengthened Putin's hold on Lukashenko. For Russia, the existence of Belarus has served a useful geopolitical purpose. It has acted as a friendly buffer state between it and NATO, Poland in particular. Belarus as an independent state within Russia's orbit allows Moscow to shore up its western frontier without directly paying the costs for its defense. However, as NATO has expanded to encompass the Baltic countries and, in 2023, Finland, Russia's calculations toward the usefulness of Belarus's independence may be starting to change. In 2023, reports began to circulate that the Kremlin might be eyeing a full annexation of Belarus by 2030. But why would it desire to do this and put itself even more on NATO's collective border? The war in Ukraine may have been a reason for the Kremlin to shift some of its long-standing policy toward Belarus. While Belarus hosted Russian troops that took part in the Battle of Kyiv, it did not commit its own forces to that campaign. Lukashenko may be a close ally of Putin, but he was not eager to join his war directly. Belarus has stated it would only become an active combatant in Ukraine if it is attacked. As time has gone on and the war continues with no end in sight, Lukashenko must be convinced that he made the right decision. Belarus may be an economically and politically isolated country, but it is not nearly as isolated as its main benefactor. The lack of a complete unity of interest between Belarus and Russia poses problems for the latter. With Belarus as an independent country, Russia lacks a way to put pressure on Ukraine's capital at a moment's notice. It also lacks the easiest way to deploy troops on the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia, outside of the confined and surrounded enclave of Kaliningrad. If Belarus were annexed to Russia, it would have more options to station assets to put pressure on Ukraine and NATO at any time the Kremlin wanted. For example, an annexation of Belarus would put Russia's western border at the Suwalki Gap, a narrow line that stretches from Russian Kaliningrad to Belarus's western border, near Grodno. A pincer drive from Grodno and Kaliningrad would be able to cut Poland off from Lithuania and isolate the Baltic states from the rest of NATO by land. However, this option is not available to the Kremlin unless Belarus allows it. Russia and Putin have long been contemptuous of the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and eager to project more power into the Baltic. The threat of cutting those states off from the rest of NATO over land would be a valuable strategic option for Russia to be able to exercise in its foreign policy. An annexation of Belarus would mean that Russia would no longer need to go through diplomatic channels to exercise its military leverage there. Though Lukashenko is usually keen to please Russia, there is no guarantee that will be the case in the future whenever Belarus gets a new leader. and Lukashenko has already diverged from some of the Kremlin's military goals in Ukraine. With Russia now isolated from much of the world, the Kremlin will look for additional options to exert leverage over NATO, meaning the existence of Belarus as a buffer state may no longer be within what it deems are its best interests. In 2023, a 17-page leaked document from Moscow with the title "Strategic Goals of the Russian Federation in Belarus" began to circulate. This document is one which Western intelligence services view as authentic. Some of the document's headlines include the plan for Russia and Belarus to come under the same currency, presumably the Russian ruble, taxation system, and military command by 2030. These goals would be in line for the project of a so-called Greater Russia, a notion that Vladimir Putin brought up in early 2022 with a 5,000-word essay that is now seen as his ideological reasoning for starting the war in Ukraine. Putin declared annexation of the occupied territories in Ukraine, where local residents have now been told they are considered Russian citizens and should apply for Russian passports. It would also be consistent with the Greater Russia idea and is also consistent with the Kremlin's supposed goals in Belarus. The Strategic Goals of the Russian Federation in Belarus document goes over short, medium, and long-term goals for the Kremlin in Belarus. The short-term goals include a greater voice for Russia in Belarusian domestic politics, including a reform to its constitution to serve Russian interests. It also intends to limit pro-Western dissent in that country of the type seen after the 2020 elections there. Lukashenko has already largely acceded to these demands. In the intermediate term, all Belarusian citizens would be able to obtain Russian passports, an expression of the same policy that Russia is pursuing in the territories it currently occupies in Ukraine. In the long term, Russia would seek to control information in Belarus and forge a shared national identity through media and cultural connections, among others. Russian news and Russian pop culture would drown out other sources of information within Belarus. 2030 is an ambitious goal for such a far-reaching project, but according to the document, that is Moscow's aim. Although this document might seem like a revolution, it is actually only an acceleration of long-standing Russian policy. Reportedly, Russia has had plans to annex Belarus as early as 1999, the year Vladimir Putin first assumed power. That year, Russia and Belarus signed the agreement on the establishment of the Union State. Some years later, when Russia granted its smaller neighbor a discount on its oil exports, Belarus needed to make more concessions in return. These concessions included Moscow assuming more and more political influence in Minsk. Lukashenko, though close with Russia, had tried to retain as much autonomy as he could while remaining largely sympathetic to Russian interests. 2020 would prove a turning point, however. The troubles in Belarus between 2020 and 2021 gave the Kremlin even more influence there. With the help of the Russian intelligence service, the FSB, the Belarusian security apparatus put down the anti-government wave of protests that emerged in the wake of the questionable 2020 presidential election in Belarus. There was a price to be paid for this support, however. Lukashenko now owed Moscow even more for his position. As early as March 2021, almost a year before the invasion of Ukraine, the Atlantic Council was warning of Russia's coming soft takeover of Belarus. According to the Atlantic Council, this soft takeover of Belarus would not be something spectacular, like the way Russia intervened in Ukraine in 2014 or in Georgia in 2008. Instead, it would be a frog in boiling water operation. The oil discounts from the years earlier were part of this. Lukashenko had been resisting Moscow's insistence that he export the refined petroleum products that came from this discounted oil through Russian ports. He instead routed them through ports in NATO members Latvia and Lithuania. The move ensured that the Belarusian economy would not be completely dependent on Russia. But in early 2021, Lukashenko changed course, and Belarus is now exporting these products through Russian ports. Russia's helping him out of the domestic troubles he faced in 2020 and 2021 came with consequences. Meanwhile, even before the war in Ukraine, Russia was steadily building up a large military presence in Belarus. Shortly before the invasion, Russia and Belarus signed a 5-year strategic partnership agreement that would see the construction of 3 joint military centers. 2 would be in Russian territory. The third would be in the western Grodno region of Belarus, near the Suwalki Gap. Lukashenko also conceded that Russia would be able to build a new Russian airbase on Belarusian territory, an effort he had resisted for a long time. In 2022, even after the failed attempt to take Kyiv, Russia still maintained a significant military presence in Belarus. In the fall of that year, it stationed 9,000 troops on the border between Belarus and Ukraine. hoping to tie down Ukrainian forces in that area and prevent them from reinforcing the fronts near Kharkiv and Kherson, where Ukraine was retaking vast swathes of captured territory from the invaders. According to the leaked annexation document, the Russian military presence in Belarus will continue to expand until it becomes permanent and the Belarusian army is subordinated to the Russian one. This will be one of its long-term goals to be achieved by 2030. Despite all of Russia's far-reaching aims, the Atlantic Council does not expect there to be a formal, lawful annexation of Belarus. Rather, the Russian expanding intervention in Belarus will be more like a grey zone operation. Russia would be in control of Belarus, in fact, while leaving its current borders formally intact. For Putin and the Kremlin, it would be better to make these moves now, with Lukashenko still in power. The unrest following the heavily criticized election of 2020 must have made Moscow remember what happened in Ukraine between 2013 and 2014. The last thing the Kremlin would want to see is a similar regime change in Belarus, which could take that country too further into the orbit of the West and away from Russia. Putin's intervention in favor of Lukashenko came with consequences of their own, as his propping up of the dictator made the people of Belarus less trustful of Russia and more pro-Western in sentiment. Shades of the Maidan movement in Ukraine almost a decade earlier were impossible to ignore for Moscow, and this may have sped up the long-held annexation plans. These underlying tensions may be a problem for Russia, as it supposedly begins to deploy some of its nuclear weapons on bases in Belarusian territory. On June 14, 2023, Lukashenko announced that his country had started to take delivery of some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons, which, according to him, were up to 3 times as powerful as the bombs the United States dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. If this is true, it would be the first time that Russia has deployed part of its nuclear arsenal on non-Russian territory since the fall of the Soviet Union. Russia, of course, would retain its control of the nuclear weapons. Putin stated that these weapons would be deployed upon completion of special storage facilities on the territory of its smaller neighbor. Russia's dictator partially justified the plan, which came in the face of international opposition, by pointing out how the United States had deployed its own nuclear arsenal on the soils of allied countries over many decades. In other words, he said he was creating something like a Russian nuclear umbrella to rival the long-standing American version. Lukashenko declared that Belarus still had nuclear storage facilities from the Soviet era and would be fixing them to host the new weapons. In an earlier statement, he declared his willingness and ability to host longer-range missiles, presumably capable of delivering strategic nuclear warheads if the need arose. Lukashenko's justification for the deployment of these weapons was that Belarus had always been a target and needed them for deterrence, especially in the wake of the West's attempt to topple him following the 2020 election, according to him. It is important to understand that both Putin and Belarus's dictator are known for using hyperbolic rhetoric. It has not yet been independently confirmed that Russia has begun delivering some of its nuclear weapons onto Belarusian soil as of July 10, 2023. If delivery has not yet begun, Russia may have second thoughts. For Moscow, the deployment of these weapons on the territory of a still independent country, even one that it has close ties with, comes at the price of several risks. Although the Belarusian government will not have control over these weapons, its agreeing to act as a host nevertheless exposes Russia to risk. Recall that in the Belgorod raid from May, 2 groups of dissident Russian fighters came within miles of a nuclear weapons storage facility. Unlike the United States' network of allies and nuclear umbrella partners, Belarus is far from a stable country. The world witnessed that firsthand in 2020 and 2021. Meanwhile, the Russians have unfortunately shown that they cannot always be relied on to keep their nuclear weapons stored without worries. What if instability in Belarus springs up again? Belarus's constitution mandates another formal election in 2025, the year that Russia wishes to meet some of its intermediate goals in its supposed annexation plan. Suppressing any unrest that springs up in Belarus in response to the coming unfree and unfair election will be a high priority for Russia. The presence of nuclear weapons in Belarus raises the stakes. In an interview for the Radio Times, William Courtney, the former special assistant for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Clinton administration, noted that pilots from the United States NATO allies are trained to deliver American nuclear weapons from their respective countries' soil as part of the standard operating procedure for the alliance. That involves a level of trust that the Russians would never have in the Belarusians. Courtney said in the interview, because the Belarusian pilot might go in the opposite direction with that nuclear weapon, east, rather than west. He brought up the 2020 and 2021 protests against Lukashenko and, by extension, Russian influence in Belarus. It is little wonder why some Belarusian elements might seize the opportunity to use nuclear leverage over Russia if they got the chance. and why the Russians do not trust them like the United States trusts its NATO allies. This is why suppressing nationalist elements is a key short-term goal outlined in Russia's leaked document about its supposed annexation plans in Belarus. And then there is Lukashenko himself. It is human nature to seek more power and possessions, but an even stronger desire is to not lose the things one already has. This is especially true of power. Powerful people do not want to lose their power. This would be particularly so with someone like Alexander Lukashenko, who has exercised power in almost unlimited form for 30 years. Lukashenko may usually be eager to please his overlord Putin, but that does not mean he is eager to do so at the cost of losing his own position, should the so-called United State between Russia and Belarus evolve into outright annexation. Unfortunately for Belarus's long-standing dictator, he is running out of options. He is trapped between the West, refusing to recognize his legitimacy, and Russia, which seems to be accelerating its plans to annex Belarus and leave him a ceremonial figure at best. For 3 decades, Lukashenko has been able to keep the Kremlin mostly pleased, while also maintaining most of his initiative to govern Belarus as he saw fit. The disputed 2020 election in Belarus and Moscow's subsequent intervention to put down the unrest between then and early 2021 changed the balance of power, though shifting it yet more in Russia's favor. The balance of power again changed after the invasion of Ukraine, and Lukashenko lost even more clout in his relationship with Putin. How might he be able to claw some of it back? One way that Belarus's dictator might try to regain some leverage in the bilateral relationship with Russia could be to use nuclear weapons that he is supposedly about to host on his own soil as a form of leverage. Although he will not be able to actually launch these weapons, he does control the territory from which they would be based and supplied. Lukashenko can use his control of that territory to attempt to demand concessions from the Kremlin. That is only speculation, but the Russian plan to annex Belarus exposes that the two countries' partnership is not all that it seems. The interests of the dictators do not tend to make for a long, stable partnership. Their views of the world can diverge quickly, and their people tend to have concerns of their own. Russia once thought that Ukraine was safely in its orbit too, until its people looked to the West and refused further integration with the Russian economy, revolting against the ruling regime in Kyiv to ensure that would not happen. When new pro-Western leaders came to power in Kyiv, Ukraine's long-running status as being within Russia's sphere of influence deteriorated rapidly, to the extent that Russia is now fighting a costly war to keep Ukraine in its orbit. But what do you think? Might the same thing one day happen in Belarus? Or might Lukashenko or an authoritarian successor of his prove a less trustworthy partner for a Russian version of the nuclear umbrella? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Let's say that you're Russia or China, and you're looking for ways to expand your influence on the world order. Unfortunately for you, there is a major roadblock in your way: the United States nuclear umbrella. Great power competition may be returning after a post-Cold War slumber, and adversaries may feel more confident about flexing their muscles these days. But this long-standing policy remains a bulwark of American deterrence. China and Russia are trying their hands, but their attempts to shift the world order have been obstructed by the presence of allies protected by America's nuclear arsenal, leaving them with far fewer opportunities to accomplish their objectives. So what exactly is a nuclear umbrella, and who gets to hide under its canopy? At its most basic, the United States nuclear umbrella is a function of its system of alliances. As part of its commitment to allies, the United States has implied both the will and the means to use its nuclear weapons to protect them from aggression. The umbrella currently extends to longtime allies like NATO partners Japan, South Korea, and Australia. There is no formal binding agreement creating the nuclear umbrella. Rather, it is an informal understanding that the United States will defend its close allies from nuclear aggression with a retaliatory nuclear response. The nuclear umbrella therefore accomplishes 2 strategic goals. First, it deters other countries, like Russia and an increasingly aggressive China, from using their nuclear weapons or invading countries covered by the umbrella, for fear of nuclear escalation. Second, it prevents nuclear proliferation, as America's allies will feel less of a need to create their own nuclear arsenals to defend themselves, as they can rely on the United States instead. A good example of the nuclear umbrella in practice can be found in the North Korean security challenge. Although North Korea has had a long-standing nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program, neither South Korea nor Japan, who are most threatened, have responded with nuclear programs of their own, because of the implicit American security guarantee. Another example of the nuclear umbrella in practice would be in Eastern Europe. For historical and strategic reasons, Russia would like to reincorporate the Baltic states into its orbit, but unlike Ukraine, these countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are NATO members, with both Article 5 protection and an implicit understanding that they are under the US nuclear umbrella should Russia resort to nuclear saber-rattling. Great news for places like Japan and Lithuania, but what about the rest of the world? Some American national security experts have called for expanding the American nuclear umbrella's reach and guarantees. For example, with the potential for a nuclear-armed Iran, the umbrella may need to be extended to other countries in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, lest it develop its own nuclear weapons in response and create an atomic arms race in the Middle East. Other experts disagree with nuclear umbrella expansion because they believe that it will create new risks to the United States, while increasing the reliance on nuclear weapons and atomic threats for security, and thus the incentive to create them. This is part of the reason why NATO expansion has not been universally well received in Washington. These experts are also wary of the potentiality for nuclear escalation should the United States overexpose itself on implied commitments to use these weapons of mass destruction. Although it has been a successful policy since the start of the atomic age, the nuclear umbrella is not as simple as it sounds. To be operational, it requires not only American capability and will, but also its security partners to trust that it is committed to using it. Sounds a little paradoxical, right? Well, here's how it works. A security official in Japan perhaps best summarized the problems in that third requirement when he asked, if you were responsible for the defense of your country and you had to depend on somebody from another country, how would you feel? This message, quoted in an article for The Diplomat from a 2009 meeting, raises the conundrum. For the US nuclear umbrella to work, cooperating countries must believe that the United States will actually defend them. And they must believe this beyond the almost ritualistic assurances that American security officials periodically make. Trust is a vital component in the otherwise informal nuclear umbrella agreement. Otherwise, these countries will have an incentive to create their own nuclear weapons despite their participation in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. North Korea poked holes in the NPT when it withdrew from the treaty in order to develop its own nuclear weapons. Although anti-nuclear attitudes are obviously strong among American allies like Japan, long-term security concerns will tend to win out over shorter-term domestic political controversy. If the leaders of those countries feel the long-term vulnerability in the absence of American leadership, it's far likelier that nuclear proliferation will take place. While the international order under stress from actors like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, the United States has signaled to its allies in recent years that it remains committed to their nuclear defense. In a 2019 speech at the Brookings Institution, David J. Trachtenberg, the then Principal Deputy Undersecretary for Policy in the United States Department of Defense, noted that America had budgeted $25 billion toward efforts to modernize its nuclear triad: intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and bomber-delivered nuclear weapons, plus their means of delivery. However, although the nuclear umbrella proved successful in the Cold War, some observers have questioned whether it still makes sense even in the countries that it has long extended to. Although American security officials like Trachtenberg had attempted to assure allies of its continued commitment, President Trump has raised some fears during his campaign and tenure. For example, on the campaign trail in 2016, he mulled whether it would be better if Japan and South Korea developed their own nuclear weapons to defend themselves from North Korea, instead of relying on the United States, which in his opinion got too little out of the arrangements. Although Trump would later backtrack on these comments and made no such moves as president, his erratic nature rattled American allies and exposed this weakness in the nuclear umbrella idea. Despite the Trump years, American allies still have a high degree of trust in the United States and its commitment to their defense. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the polling firm Morning Consult took the opportunity and asked America's European, Japanese, and Australian allies about their trust in the US nuclear umbrella, among other questions. While people in these nations viewed the nuclear weapons themselves overwhelmingly negatively, they had a high degree of trust in the United States' implicit nuclear guarantee. Only in Spain did more people, 36%, say that their country needed to create nuclear weapons rather than rely on the United States. The people in Australia, 35%, Germany, 41%, Italy, 45%, and Japan, 39%, all answered that their respective countries did not need to build nuclear weapons because their allies had them. These responses were well in excess of those who answered that their nations should build their own nuclear weapons at 28%, 28%, 20%, and 18% respectively. Other people surveyed said that they did not know about or have an opinion on the subject. With the unpopularity of nuclear weapons among America's allies, it seems the nuclear umbrella policy is secure for at least the intermediate future. But how exactly does the United States secure its nuclear umbrella's range? Although this is not explicitly stated, the nuclear umbrella policy also means that in practice, the United States can forward deploy its nuclear arsenal on the soil of its allied countries. Such deployment ensures that the means of delivery are closer to potential adversaries, while making it harder to eliminate American nuclear capabilities in a first strike, enhancing the overall deterrence posture. One notable hint of this practice occurred in the summer of 2022, when the United States and South Korea started talks which would eventually result in the return of the Blue Lightning exercises, which feature potentially nuclear-capable B-52 strategic bombers flying over South Korean airspace. The last such exercise was in 2017, amid rising tensions with North Korea. Although the United States withdrew its nuclear weapons from South Korea in 1991, Blue Lightning and other exercises demonstrate the ongoing security operation between the two countries and the partnership's nuclear capability. The United States still deploys nuclear weapons from bases in Allied territories as part of its NATO commitments. About 150 American B-61 nuclear bombs are currently on NATO soil, ready to be deployed from bases in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Turkey. Although the governments of these countries have never officially confirmed their presence, it is a widely known open secret. This arrangement is part of NATO policy. Although these are American weapons and guarded by American troops, the host country would jointly need to agree to their use. Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands have at times tried to remove these weapons from their soil, but have never succeeded. There's one catch here though. Technically, their presence violates the provisions of the NPT, since the treaty forbids the transfer of nuclear weapons from recognized nuclear weapon states to non-nuclear weapon states. To get around this, the United States has argued that those weapons would not be effectively transferred until wartime, but as we've just seen, this practice is highly controversial. The United States also used to deploy nuclear weapons in Japan, but withdrew these in the late 1960s and early 1970s after controversy. However, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the threat posed by a nuclear-capable North Korea, and a more aggressive China prompted the late former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to suggest that these weapons of mass destruction may need to come back to Japanese soil. In March, Abe pondered whether it would be necessary to return to a nuclear sharing arrangement for deterrence, such as that seen in NATO, stating, "We should not put a taboo on discussions about the reality we face." Current Japanese PM Fumio Kishida shot the idea down, but with Russia and China unlikely to stop their attempts to increase their influence and change the world order, it is likely that such debates will continue in America's nuclear umbrella allies in the coming years. There is a final ingredient required for the nuclear umbrella to work. America's enemies must also perceive that the threat is credible, since the object of the policy is deterrence. The United States has never explicitly confirmed the nuclear umbrella as a set-in-stone policy, and in his 2019 speech, Trachtenberg noted that it was important to keep potential adversaries like China and Russia guessing whether the United States would actually use its nuclear weapons. Because the nuclear umbrella remains more of an idea, even if a long-standing one, than formal policy doctrine or treaty, there will always remain room for interpretation among enemies and allies alike. Vladimir Putin clearly did not believe that the nuclear umbrella would be a factor before he invaded Ukraine. Ukraine, which surrendered its inherited Soviet nuclear weapons in 1994, did so on the basis that the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia would guarantee its security. Such guarantees, Putin calculated, turned out to be worthless. Ukraine was not a NATO member and therefore not covered under the nominal nuclear umbrella. Nevertheless, the invasion demonstrates that US security guarantees are not always ironclad, especially when they don't come in the form of a treaty. Taiwan is in much the same position that Ukraine was before the invasion. It has no formal alliance with the United States and is not covered under the nuclear umbrella. Its neighbor Japan, which China has territorial disputes with, is. Would the Chinese leadership be deterred from invading Taiwan for fear of escalation involving Japan and the nuclear umbrella? Such questions remain unanswered, but they are the most crucial plank in the nuclear umbrella. Just because something has worked in the past does not mean that it will continue to work in the future. This fact means that the United States will need to reinforce its nuclear capabilities, relationships with its participating allies, and the implication, even if informal, that they will be covered under the nuclear umbrella in the worst-case scenario of a rainy day. So what do you think? Is the American nuclear umbrella powerful enough to deter countries like Russia or China from direct and all-out attacks on other nations. What would you change, if anything, regarding this policy? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. From the war in Ukraine to the growing conflict in Israel, the battlefield is constantly changing. New weapons continue to roll off the assembly line, and politics becomes more convoluted every day. In the past, NATO has been a champion of peace, unity, and democracy worldwide. Emerging victorious from the Cold War, its role has shifted, with some people questioning its place on the world stage. Do NATO's weaknesses outweigh its strengths? Let's talk about it. But we need to start with a little context first. Both of the world wars were destructive on an almost biblical level, and out of the ashes, people were left with a feeling of never again. But post-World War II, the world's political situation was a little complicated. The Soviet Union, once a friend to the Western powers and a crucial ally in defeating Nazi Germany, now found themselves at odds over who controlled what in Europe. As things spiraled out of control and tensions escalated, it became more apparent to the US, UK, and other Western countries that something needed to be done to ensure their hard-won peace continued. And thus, NATO was founded. Established in 1949 with the hope of preserving peace in Europe, it aimed to deter the Soviet threat that loomed over the land. It's designed to operate primarily as a defensive alliance. If an outside party attacked any of the member nations, then all of the nations of NATO would respond in force. Paradoxically, nothing guarantees peace quite like the promise of extreme violence. But how big of a guarantee was this? Since 1949, NATO has seen its membership grow to 31 countries around Europe and 40 additional partner countries globally. While not full members, the partner countries and NATO work together to achieve shared goals of peace and prosperity. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, its role changed significantly. NATO forces undertook significant combat operations for the first time in the Bosnian War in the mid-90s, the Kosovo War in the late 90s, and continued to expand its capabilities with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. After the September 11th attacks, something big happened. Article 5 of the NATO Charter was invoked for the first time and only time in the organization's history. This called on all members of the alliance to consider the attack on the United States as an attack on all of them. This acceleration in military operations did not slow down after that, and NATO found itself even further involved in conflicts throughout the Middle East. But why is NATO's involvement or non-involvement in these and similar conflicts so crucial? What exactly are its main strengths? First and foremost, NATO's greatest asset, and the main idea behind its founding, is deterrence and defense through strength in unity. All for one and one for all, as the saying goes. The Soviet Union had emerged from World War II as a military and industrial juggernaut. Their nuclear arms program, armed forces, and the military-industrial complex on the home front had turned it from a struggling country with strange political ideas to a heavyweight fighter who was ready to square up with the best the US had to offer. The idea of strength through unity worked well enough to keep Soviet tanks from rolling through West Germany, extinguish the always resurgent flames of nationalism, and avoid Europe becoming a nuclear wasteland all throughout the Cold War. As NATO expanded to countries in Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and even as far east as Turkey, untold number of regional conflicts were avoided and peace largely reigned. No one dared attack a member of NATO because if they did, they knew they'd have American-made fiery precision burning their house down faster than thought possible. Say what you will about the US, but when it comes to making weapons, it really is second to none. Possessing some of the finest weaponry in the world and also working together as a unified team spells power. In Afghanistan, for instance, the NATO forces were made up of troops from every member nation, with the overall commander position being occupied by a revolving door of generals from multiple nations. With a unified command structure for all the NATO forces involved, their mission was clear and concise, ready to strike as a cohesive unit. All of this cohesion has many benefits as the world continues to evolve and the political and military landscape shifts. With new technology and new weapons always being produced, NATO stands ready to adapt to new threats. Protection against cyber attacks, for example, is a key part of NATO's defense and deterrence plan and is becoming increasingly vital. Cooperative security is absolutely crucial here, as nations need to work together to mitigate the ever-changing and complex cyber attacks that are being employed. This idea goes beyond cybersecurity and really applies to all facets of NATO's defense. Without coordinated efforts and training, the alliance would be extremely vulnerable to threats. But for all of its highbrow ideals and extravagant plans, NATO has some glaring weaknesses that could prove disastrous if a few things don't go their way. As the list of NATO members grows longer and many smaller Eastern European countries are brought into the fold, you would think that this means an even more secure peace, but that might not necessarily be the case. As NATO inches further eastward, what has really happened is it has backed the Russian bear into a corner, the results of which might doom the world. But before we get into that, let's take a quick trip back to the 90s. A great time for grunge and low-waisted pants, not so much for anyone living in post-Soviet Union Russia, where political and economic turmoil left the country like a ship without a rudder. The breakup of the Soviet Union left a lot of questions to be answered about the borders of Eastern Europe and the expansion of NATO. During negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1990, the US made assurances to their Russian counterparts that with the reunification of Europe, NATO would not expand its membership to Moscow's doorstep. Both sides came away satisfied with the progress they had made and called it a day. Like any good politician, the US and NATO immediately went back on their word and began the process of expanding eastward. As you might have guessed, this enraged Moscow, who claimed that NATO had broken its agreement and done exactly the opposite of what it had promised. NATO simply shrugged and said we didn't have anything in writing, so get over it. Russia during the 90s and 2000s was very vulnerable, and they were still picking up the pieces of their broken empire, so they were in no place to put up too much of an argument, but they never forgot. As each US president since 1990 has advanced NATO's boundaries eastward, tensions have skyrocketed and finally exploded with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Potential NATO expansion into Ukraine is one of Putin's key justifications for starting the war. In March of 2022, President Joe Biden vowed to defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of its collective power. But what if certain NATO members break formation and want to attempt negotiation rather than fight? All it really takes is instability of some kind to take hold in a few countries for Putin to gamble that the reward outweighs the risk, and that's exactly what NATO has been afraid of. With the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, NATO has been paralyzed by fear of antagonizing Putin and has, whenever possible, tried to steer clear of his way. Putin knew the advantage he had and acted accordingly. Several countries, including Germany and Turkey, have significant economic relations with Russia, and this leverage caused them to hesitate and not react decisively as a cohesive group. Up until the launching of the invasion of Ukraine, Germany was one of Russia's biggest trading partners on the continent, and even imported 50 to 70% of its natural gas from them. Turkey also benefited greatly from their trade with Russia, with the trade volume between the two countries being worth around $26 billion in 2019. Even with the invasion of Ukraine, this deep-seated division over how to deal with Russian aggression reared its ugly head. No significant NATO aid was delivered to Ukraine before the invasion, and there was even hesitation in the immediate aftermath. If NATO had taken preemptive action and cooperated with each other, there is a chance Ukraine could have struck a decisive blow early on, but sadly we'll never know. Most NATO members don't exactly have the strongest militaries, so if the alliance was in jeopardy, some countries, the Baltic ones especially, would be cannon fodder for the Russian war machine. Knowing full well that they would be on the front line, would countries like Latvia or Lithuania stand up and fight, or just roll over and let Russia walk on in? American firepower is a hell of a deterrent, but a lot could happen before the cavalry could ride to the rescue. No one could say for certain what will happen until they hear those T-90s rumbling in the distance. Even Europe's supposed military superpowers, the UK, France, and Germany, have let their militaries atrophy ever since the Cold War, with a brief resurgence with their involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, but then right back to letting them waste away. Their troop numbers and available resources hardly leave them able to effectively fight a ground war against a major military power anytime soon. The British military, for instance, is at its smallest size since they were fighting Napoleon with flintstock muskets and swords. Yep, you heard that right. Overextending themselves into unstable territory is a massive risk for NATO, as the chance of getting pulled into armed conflict continues to climb. At the end of the day, troop and resource commitment by NATO members is voluntary. So if Estonia or the Czech Republic, for example, decides not to honor the agreement, it may have a domino effect, leaving the US holding the bag, even more than it already is. That leads us to another massive weakness in NATO's defense plan. As it currently stands, the United States covers about 2/3 of NATO defense spending. 2/3. For reference, NATO defense spending in 2022 totaled around $1 trillion. 2/3 of that is roughly $660 billion. Having 2/3 of your eggs in one metaphorical basket is pretty much never a good idea. What if something happened and the US could no longer contribute as much money and resources to the NATO defense budget? As unlikely as it seems for the US to stop producing outrageous amounts of weapons, or for the economy to take a nosedive, crazier things have happened. In 2006, the NATO defense ministers agreed that 2% of each country's GDP should be put towards collective defense spending. Year after year, most of the countries fall laughably short. In 2022, only the US, Estonia, Greece, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and the United Kingdom hit the mark. So it's safe to say that without US assistance, NATO would be about as effective as the Postal Service would be if they had to go back to using horses. The over-reliance on US manpower and resources for protection could seriously come back to haunt NATO. Controlling a large majority of the defense budget gives them a tremendous amount of leverage to theoretically direct NATO where they want it to go. The US is currently the majority supplier of arms and ammunition to Ukraine. As of September 2023, over $46 billion has been sent to Ukraine in the shape of weapons, ammunition, logistical and security training, support equipment, and loans to go and buy more stuff. The aid is proving to be crucial to the Ukrainian resistance, as they doggedly defend every trench line and outpost against the Russian behemoth. Its weapons like the Javelin and Stinger missiles are giving the Ukrainians an edge against the Russians. These mobile weapon systems allow soldiers to pick off Russian armor and aircraft and retreat into the trees unseen. Seems like the Russians learned nothing from their time in Afghanistan. Now, while most would probably agree that helping Ukraine is a positive thing, you have to look at the balance of aid being given. The amount of US aid being given is over double that of the closest European powers, that being Germany and the UK. The fact of the matter is the US is better equipped and more proficient at producing weapons and other war supplies than the rest of NATO because they have been at war for the past 20 years. It's not that Germany, Italy, or the UK don't have assault rifles and tanks. They do have lots of them, but only enough of them to supply their own armies. That's why Ukraine did not receive its shipment of Leopard tanks from Germany until over a year into the invasion. They simply did not have enough to spare. With the NATO scales so heavily tilted in the US's favor, you have to question if this alliance is actually fair and equal as it claims to be, or do the other NATO members go along with whatever the US wants just to maintain the status quo? While the US certainly profits tremendously from trading with a peaceful Europe, war has always proven to be a huge moneymaker for the ones who produce the weapons. Further militarization of Europe only benefits the US. This leverage that the US holds over NATO further cements American influence in Europe, and that influence is going to keep growing as long as the balance of power remains that way. In 2020, the US and Poland signed an agreement that allowed 10,000 US troops to be stationed on Polish soil, acting as a boots-on-the-ground check to Russian aggression in the region. The US military is also in the process of opening some bases in Romania, hoping to extend NATO naval reach to the Black Sea. The US has taken a similar approach to combating the threat posed by China, with multiple bases around the Pacific. These bases in the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, etc., give the US the ability to counter a Chinese attack and provide logistical support at incredible speeds. With this much of a presence and a tremendous amount of influence in the region, NATO better hope and pray that the US remains peaceful and on the defensive. Another potential problem for NATO that has been gaining traction in recent years is that of the changes in public opinion. Now, while most citizens in NATO countries have a positive opinion of the alliance, there is a slightly growing dissent amongst Americans as to the effectiveness and relevance of NATO. This goes back to the whole "don't keep 2/3 of your eggs in a metaphorical basket" thing. If the US was to reduce its support for NATO and/or Ukraine, the consequences could spell disaster for Europe and maybe even the world. As unlikely as this is, politics is an unpredictable game. NATO's extreme reliance on American funding and support leaves them vulnerable to a variety of problems that could arise. This is an issue that will be discussed at length in every presidential election to come and will grow in the minds of its citizens as the war in Ukraine deepens. The most dangerous threat to NATO, however, might come from inside its own alliance. Ever since Turkish President Erdogan has been in office, Turkey has acted essentially in its own self-interest, with little regard for how its actions affect the rest of NATO. Always the political wildcard, Turkey knows how to keep things interesting. Turkey joined NATO during the height of the Cold War in 1952, hoping for protection from a potential Soviet invasion across the Straits of the Dardanelles. Turkey had been applying for NATO membership for years and was only accepted when the US and other NATO members realized the defensive value they would have in the event of Soviet aggression. Since Turkey gained membership, it's proved itself to be a valuable member of the alliance, as they possess the second largest military behind the United States and possess multiple important military bases, including the Incirlik and Konya air bases. From an economic perspective, Turkey has the potential to be a major player on the world stage. It's the 19th largest economy in the world and has a GDP of $906 billion. Employing ambitious reforms from 2006 to 2017, Turkey saw income rates rise and widespread poverty reduction. While economic growth has stalled as of late, the potential is still there. The area around the Sea of Marmara is also an extremely valuable resource for Turkey, NATO, and the world. This area is rich in agricultural land and is also home to some of the most profitable and important trade routes in the world. It's very clear why, from both a military and economic perspective, Turkey is such a valuable member of the alliance. But that doesn't mean its membership has all been smooth sailing. With such a wide variety of countries in NATO, it's always possible that one of them could step out of line and do something to strain the unity of the alliance. Turkey continues to find itself in regional conflicts with its neighbors or groups close to the region. The longest-running conflict it's still fighting is without a doubt with the Kurdish people. For reference, the Kurds are an ethnic group who reside in parts of Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, and their population numbers around 30 to 40 million. They have been fighting this bloody war with Turkey since 1978, and no end is in sight. This conflict especially complicates things for Turkey, as killing Kurds will only alienate them from the United States. The Kurds and the US have had a relationship going back decades now, and the Kurds have served as an important partner for US interests in the region, most recently in the fight against ISIS. In 2017, the UN expressed concern about the Turkish treatment of Kurds, but nothing was actually done about it. In the same year, the US attempted to supply Kurdish forces with weapons, but Turkey objected, claiming that doing so violated NATO rules. Turkey claims that the Kurds are nothing more than terrorists and want to wipe them out, but the US claims that the Kurds have been their partners for years and are not terrorists. So while men in suits debate this and make eloquent arguments in fancy rooms, the brutal truth is that people on the ground are going to keep getting killed until NATO can figure out what side of the fence it's on. Besides Turkey's ongoing saber-rattling with the Kurds, they continue to be problematic neighbors for the rest of the Middle East and Europe. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Turkey unequivocally supported Ukraine and pledged to support them militarily for the duration of the war. This show of unity with the rest of NATO was not out of the goodness of their heart, but a strategic one. They could not allow Russia to control any more of the Black Sea and shift the balance of power in the region. While not a surprising move, it might be worth keeping an eye on Turkey throughout the duration of the conflict. Another area in which Turkey is becoming increasingly problematic for NATO is the fact that they have backslid from a budding democracy to an increasingly authoritarian regime under President Erdogan. He continues to crush any opposition to his rule and consolidate his power, including making changes to Turkey's parliamentary system to benefit him and his party. Turkey has also suppressed freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and removed the checks and balances that are a staple of true democracies. They have even gone as far as jailing political opponents, journalists, and anyone who is in favor of dissent. This regression has of course harmed the citizens of Turkey the most, as state institutions are eroded and the economy loses momentum. The final nail in the democratic coffin seemingly occurred with their last election in May of 2023, where President Erdogan was re-elected in what almost certainly were not free or fair elections. Going more toward authoritarianism is extremely troubling to NATO, as this goes against one of the pillars of the alliance, that being the promotion of democracy, a value that is supposed to be shared by all members of NATO. So as Turkey becomes more authoritarian, and it doesn't show any signs of slowing down, its relationship with its NATO allies is becoming increasingly strained. For all the headaches they cause their allies, Turkey remains an important part of NATO. Their regional and strategic importance has allowed them to get away with a lot, but at some point will NATO say enough is enough? As Turkey continues to play fast and loose with its foreign policy and continues to act in its own interest, There may come a point where NATO believes their membership cannot be justified anymore. The usual tactic they employ is waiting out problematic leaders and using a combination of political and economic pressure to effect change, but it might not be enough. As it currently stands, there is no mechanism for suspension or expulsion from NATO. However, that does not mean that it theoretically couldn't happen. If Turkey was to take a step too far, NATO could find them in material breach of the treaty and find creative ways to remove them. This is unlikely, as Turkey would have to do something rather extreme, but it's technically possible. Only time will tell, but it looks like as of the production of this video, that Turkey isn't moving in the right direction. Looking at NATO as a whole, there are enough strengths and weaknesses to keep political analysts and the talking heads on TV busy until the end of time. NATO has historically proven that they have been a force for good and have promoted peace and democracy throughout the world. It's not out of line to say that the unity of NATO and its deterrence of the Soviet Union probably helped save the world from nuclear annihilation through mutually assured destruction. Not too shabby. After the resounding victory in the Cold War and the dawn of a new era for NATO, they have adapted to new threats and worked, for the most part, as a cohesive team, ready to face new military, technological, and humanitarian challenges head-on. The world never sits still, and the ever-changing political landscape is seemingly more complicated than ever. NATO's unity and values are going to be continually put to the test as new crises and conflicts arise. Will they close ranks and de-escalate things, or will division and tensions allow the alliance to be dragged into wars that could be their undoing? Overextension of the alliance into unstable countries is certainly a risk, as more members of NATO means more potential for conflict to arise. Remember the phrase all for one and one for all. Following its current trend, it also means that the United States is paying the defense bill for a growing list of countries. While this is great for the Americans' weapons manufacturing industry, this over-reliance on American bombs and bullets could prove disastrous if public opinion shifts or some once-in-a-lifetime economic crisis unfolds. However unlikely, it's worth considering. American influence in Europe has grown exponentially since the creation of NATO, and it doesn't seem like it will stop anytime soon. The US continues to build military bases and station troops in Europe, while also being the chief source of all things weapon-related. This gives the US a tremendous amount of influence and leverage over the other members of the alliance. This amount of power requires extremely careful handling going forward. You might want to dig a little deeper when thinking about who to vote for in the next election, my American friends. NATO has its fair share of issues, but debatably the biggest one comes from Turkey. Once a democracy, they have become an authoritative regime that imprisons political opponents and squashes free speech. It continues to act in its own self-interest and stoke the flames of regional conflicts with neighbors. Its involvement in Syria, Libya, and the ongoing campaign against the Kurdish people has only served to create more division in NATO and make people question the true nature of the alliance. As problematic as they are, Turkey remains a powerful ally that sits at the crossroads of the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, and likely won't be going anywhere in the near future. All in all, NATO has its strengths and weaknesses like any organization. Historically, it's carried the torch for the betterment of humanity, but as the world continues to evolve and situations change, will it still be needed? Let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more military content from military experts. The war in Ukraine is still raging, and despite Putin's repeated failure to secure enough military manpower with actual training and experience to make any lasting headway on the battlefields, or simply stop embarrassing himself by losing dozens of tanks every week, Russia doesn't seem to be backing off anytime soon. How will the Russo-Ukraine conflict progress? Will it involve Russia's inevitable attack on members of NATO? And if the bear ever decides to strike again, is NATO ready to respond? Let's find out. This is Belgium, famous for its fluffy waffles, artisanal chocolate, and for being home to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, aka NATO. While NATO's headquarters are based in Brussels, the capital of Belgium, its powerful member countries span over continents and include some of the world's most powerful militaries, including the UK, France, Spain, Germany, Turkey, and of course, the US. Impressive, right? But while NATO is composed of as many as 31 member countries with access to combined military forces of approximately 3.6 million active duty personnel, the US military is still one of the largest in the world, with over 1.3 million active duty personnel and more than 800,000 reserve personnel. Let's just say it's a good thing that NATO and the US are in the frat house. Since its very inception in 1949, NATO has reckoned with the possibility of having to fend off a Russian attack. The hows and the whys of that particular scenario were always in flux, but the threat remained the same. Thanks in part to its Ukrainian miscalculation, today Russia, on paper at least, no longer presents the same threat as it once did. According to a very recent report from the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces in Ukraine are operating in decentralized and largely degraded formations throughout the theater, and the current pattern of deployment suggests that most available units are already online and engaged in either offensive or defensive operations. That leaves virtually no troops left over to attack elsewhere, and that's good news for NATO. But because of its undeniable history of aggressive behavior under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, states underestimate Russia at their own peril. Well, NATO certainly isn't making that mistake. Russia remains its primary geopolitical adversary, and you can be sure it is poised and ready for whatever Russia can throw at it. What exactly does NATO deploy to defend its borders? NATO has had a credible military presence on Europe's eastern flank for nearly a decade now, and since 2022, it has only grown stronger. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the Baltic states eagerly submitted their application for NATO membership, having agreed to undertake the required political and military reforms. On March 29, 2004, the trio of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia successfully joined the world's most powerful military bloc. Since then, these small states, along with Finland, who just this year became the alliance's newest member, have become arguably the most important actors in a hypothetical war against Russia. It is them, after all, who share long, difficult-to-patrol borders with their eastern neighbor, and it is them who will be NATO's first line of defense in a hypothetical war scenario with Russia. Unlike Finland, who immediately brought a robust reserve of 280,000 soldiers, 650 tanks, including 200 German-manufactured Leopards, and what many consider Western Europe's strongest artillery to NATO upon joining, the Baltics had to fight an uphill battle to bring their relatively humble forces up to snuff. When we say humble, here's what we mean. Estonia possesses 1,976 armored fighting vehicles, Latvia has 2,930, and Lithuania has 5,456 armored fighting vehicles, and none of these countries have any tanks. Finland also has a larger active military personnel count compared to Lithuania's 17,000, Latvia's 6,000, and Estonia's 5,000. In short, Finland is pretty hardcore when it comes to military power in Europe, and we're guessing everybody was really glad it decided to join NATO, especially the Baltic countries. As one retired US military officer noted, upon joining the alliance, the Baltic states were at 1 on a 1 to 10 scale of military capabilities. They needed arms, they needed ammunition, they needed vehicles, and they needed training, and they needed it all fast. This their Western allies agreed to provide them with the aim of making them interoperable with Western-style thinking and doctrine. The Baltic states reciprocated, having proved their loyalty by deploying forces on UN missions and making a not insignificant contribution to NATO operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. You may not realize, for instance, that it was Estonia that agreed to fight alongside Western allies in the Middle East without any national caveats, and for its efforts suffered one of the highest ratios of deaths per capita of any of the Allied countries. Having transformed their political and military systems in a remarkably short period of time, the Baltics emerged as NATO's most critical region. Since the early 2000s, Moscow has repeatedly claimed it was NATO's eastward enlargement that threatened its territorial security and drove it to invade its neighbors. This rhetoric has only intensified as Putin sought justification for his unwarranted invasion of Ukraine, and Finland's accession to NATO succeeded in 2023. Today, NATO's eastern flank is at the center of its strategy to deter and defend itself from a potential Russian attack. This was not always the case. Similar to the way Putin cites NATO's otherwise peaceful enlargement as his rationale for fighting in Ukraine, NATO cited Putin's aggression as its rationale for reinforcing its eastern border. Back in 2014, Russia violated Ukrainian sovereignty by invading and annexing the Crimean Peninsula. This was when the Russo-Ukrainian War truly began. Russia's advance alarmed NATO members, who vowed to strengthen their defenses in response. 2 years later, at the 2016 NATO summit in Warsaw, Poland, the alliance announced its Enhanced Forward Presence, or EFP, operational plan, a tailored forward presence to better deter a Russian attack. Starting in 2017, NATO deployed 4 multinational battle groups to the region, one in Estonia, one in Latvia, one in Lithuania, and one in Poland. Each contains about a battalion's worth of forces, just over 1,000 soldiers, together with their equipment, tanks, tactical armored vehicles, a headquarters company, logistics infrastructure, and everything else they would need to fight. NATO cycles new forces through each battle group on a rotational basis. Collectively, the establishment of these 4 units constituted NATO's biggest regional reinforcement in over a generation. NATO's multinational battle groups are combined arms formations, meaning they employ infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in tandem to achieve their objectives. These unique units are extremely mobile, adaptable, and flexible, trained for an array of threats and combat scenarios. The headquarters for each battle group is integrated, meaning each nation is represented at the command post. Together, they bring unique capabilities to the table in order to bolster collective defense. Each is led by a single lead nation who coordinates the battle group's actions with the host nation, who supplies the majority of their territorial defense forces. The Estonian battle group, for example, is led by the United Kingdom, who furnishes about 800 soldiers, joined by a smaller contingent of Danish, Icelandic, and French soldiers. With its capital of Tallinn just opposite Helsinki, the Estonian battle group oversees the defense of the Gulf of Finland, an incredibly important area that acts as a maritime highway to the city of Putin's birth, St. Petersburg. Further south, the Latvian battle group led by Canada, which provides about 450 soldiers, is also bolstered by forces from Albania, Czech Republic, Iceland, Italy, Montenegro, Poland, Slovakia, Slovenia, and Spain. As of 2022, Latvia hosts about 1,700 NATO soldiers as part of its enhanced forward presence. In Lithuania, a critical Baltic state that borders the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, Germany leads the multinational battle group, providing about 450 soldiers, complemented by contingents from Belgium, Norway, Luxembourg, Czech Republic, and the Netherlands. Poland possesses the largest multinational battle group, a rapid response force that would be scrambled forward if any others came under threat. It is led by the United States, who provides 1,000 soldiers on a rotational basis. They are joined by forces from the United Kingdom, Romania, and Croatia. NATO continued developing its enhanced forward presence in the Baltics until 2022, when Russia again forced it to reassess its security commitments in the east. Recognizing the changing security landscape, Ukraine's plight brought additional focus to NATO, who became more unified than ever. After the invasion, NATO members agreed to deploy 4 additional battle groups to the states adjoining Ukraine, a safeguard in case the conflict spilled over into NATO territory. Fortunately, it has not yet, but as of today, NATO has deployed multinational battle groups to Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, extending its defensive front with Russia from the Black Sea to the Baltic. According to one NATO official, these flexible units are mutually supportive and, most importantly, send a message that we're here, we're ready, and we can respond to any aggression. Colonel Di Bevan, the British commander of NATO Battle Group Estonia, commented that the beauty of NATO's forward presence comes in its unity of effort with many allies and partners, something Russia cannot boast. The fact that we are able to work so effortlessly and seamlessly together and able to integrate, he said, is a clear demonstration of the cohesive nature of the alliance and the unity that we have, and that underscores our collective defense. As part of NATO's forward presence, it is worth mentioning NATO's Baltic Air Policing Mission, a multinational air protection mission that extends over the Baltics in support of NATO's ground efforts. Operating in 4-month rotational cycles, aerial police and interdiction missions are overseen by NATO's Combined Air Operations Center UDEM in Germany, who controls multinational fighter patrols scrambled out of Germany, Lithuania's Šiauliai Air Base, and Estonia's Amari Air Base on Quick Reaction Alerts, or QRAs. Each mission tends to consist of a squad of 4 fighter aircraft supported by between 50 and 100 support personnel. Traditionally, NATO air patrols spend most of their time identifying and shadowing Russian Federal Air Force flight activity, especially around Kaliningrad where it's most dense. According to NATO's website, Russian flights routinely approach or fly near NATO airspace without using transponders, communicating with air traffic control, or having filed a flight plan. Using systems refined since the 1970s, NATO and its subordinate radar sites, control and reporting centers, and combined air operation centers can effectively ensure constant surveillance and control of its airspace 24 hours a day and 365 days a year. Rounding out its joint capabilities in the Baltic, NATO maintains multinational naval task forces in the regions composed of ships from various allied nations outfitted for an array of tasks. But the battle groups are not without their issues. Given the number of casualties sustained by both sides in Ukraine thus far, everyone, including NATO, understands that a single battalion's worth of forces would be far too anemic to actually repel a complex and concerted Russian attack. Multiple Western war games simulating a Russian assault on the Baltics have reinforced this belief. It was widely believed, dating back to 2017 when the battle groups were first installed, that they would be insufficient to prevent Russia from seizing each Baltic capital within 60 hours or less. A RAND wargame in 2021 revealed how NATO's forward-deployed forces would be rapidly overwhelmed by Russian forces, conducting a well-dispersed, fast-moving advance. That was, however, before they actually tried this in Ukraine, where Russia's true capabilities were laid bare. There are other problems, these more common to coalition and alliance warfare historically. NATO formations speak different languages, eat different rations, operate under different cultural constraints, and employ an assortment of different vehicles and weapons, all of which begs the question, how does NATO maintain its force readiness? Consistent training is key to NATO's military readiness. Regular exercises enable NATO's forward-deployed units to identify and sort out practical problems and barriers to collaboration on the ground. They help each partner understand the techniques and tactics of their allies. In addition, they provide an opportunity to work closely with NATO's air and maritime assets in simulated wargames and scenarios designed to be as realistic as possible. These exercises essentially mimic war with Russia. Each one has two teams, a blue team representing the good guys and a red team who represents Op4, or the opposing force. It's the Op4's job to put the blue team through the ringer and make sure NATO allies get a bracingly realistic training experience. Far more than walking targets, Op4 units simulate everything from conventional warfare to hybrid tactics, working day and night to keep the training audience on their toes. This means spending long nights behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, wreaking havoc, doing everything they can to instill the hard lessons better learned in practice than in the real thing. In air simulations, Allied pilots play the role of Russian aircraft on the attack, testing and probing air defenses on NATO's eastern front and training NATO aircrews for any eventuality. Back when NATO was testing its enhanced forward presence concept, wargames predicted NATO's defeat in a Russian invasion over and over again. It was startling for those paying attention. These wargames opened the alliance's eyes to gaps in its own capabilities and weaknesses it would have to contend with in a war with Russia. In these scenarios, NATO struggled to respond to an invasion of which it only had little to no notice. Likewise, it openly struggled to rapidly surge and transfer troops to the Baltics. While Russian forces only had to traverse some 200 kilometers from their border to get to the Baltic capitals, NATO forces had to travel anywhere between 300 and 600 kilometers, across far more congested territory between the enclave of Kaliningrad and Belarus. The gaps between these regions, known as the Suwalki Gap, was optimal for ambushes with long-range artillery and flank attacks from both sides. The Latvian and Estonian battalions NATO relied on to blunt the initial shock of the simulated invasions were too lightweight, too underpowered to fight off Russia's armored columns. The only armor NATO could scramble in time was light armor in a single striker battalion. Scrambled from Germany, it simply could not deploy or sustain heavy battle tanks in the field. Published as part of its 2016 report on the wargame, the RAND Corporation labeled its outcome bluntly a disaster for NATO. These fictitious scenarios may have been a blessing in disguise. Fortunately, NATO took note, deciding to build and establish a very high readiness joint task force, essentially a do-it-all international reserve force of air, ground, and maritime assets on constant alert to deploy wherever they are needed in a combat situation. NATO also began rotationally deploying US Armored Brigade combat teams in Central and Eastern Europe. On top of this, NATO has a broader response force with heavier follow-on forces it will mobilize in an emergency. At its 2022 summit in Madrid, NATO concentrated on facilitating a rapid Eastern deployment, by developing more pre-positioned equipment and weapon stockpiles, more forward-deployed capabilities, including air and defense missile systems, strengthened command and control, and upgraded defense plans. To make this all work, since 2014, the pace of NATO's large-scale military exercises has accelerated. In 2018, NATO held Exercise Trident Juncture to train up its response force, its largest multinational exercise since the Cold War, with 50,000 participating troops. In 2019, 28 different tank crews from 8 different countries descended on Latvia to practice maneuvering, targeting, and shooting exercises on the terrain they would likely have to defend from Russia. In 2020, NATO amplified these exercises further, conducting 88 exercises that ranged in scope from anti-submarine, minesweeping, and anti-surface warfare training to extreme cold weather Arctic training and strategic bombing missions. In 2021 and 2022, NATO conducted one of the world's largest and most complex live cyber defense exercises, along with logistics training deployments, electronic warfare and integrated air defense missions, and nuclear deterrence exercises. To cultivate a sense of urgency, NATO crews must train to switch missions in a flash. For example, naval crews will suddenly go from an anti-submarine mission to passenger transport to the deployment of special forces in the span of a few days. NATO sees the Euro-Atlantic security environment as one in a constant state of flux. These changes show the alliance is adapting to new challenges posed by Russian aggression. If war were to somehow break out between these two sides, NATO would be well equipped to succeed. Its combined military force now exceeds 6 million personnel, well over 4 times that of Russia. The tip of NATO's spear is much sharper, not to mention its vastly more refined support structure, categorically superior in almost every way. According to Statista, NATO also has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships, not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US. Its defense budget alone is well over 10 times that of Russia, who spent a paltry $80 billion on defense last year. The reality, if we're being honest, is that NATO no longer has to worry about such a conventional Russian attack in the same way that it used to, when Russia still possessed its untarnished reputation as the world's second most powerful military. Thanks to Ukraine, that reputation is now in tatters, and NATO's allies and partners have the indomitable courage and fighting zeal of their Ukrainian brethren to thank for that. Today, arguably the best way for NATO to prepare and respond to a Russian hypothetical attack on its own members is, ironically, to keep supporting Ukraine. It not only gains valuable intelligence on their peer adversary, but bolsters its own security in the process. Every Russian tank destroyed in Ukraine, after all, is one less tank that can be used to invade Estonia or Latvia, or any of NATO's eastern members. It is therefore in NATO's interest to continue underwriting Ukraine's war effort. NATO has been clear since the start of Russia's invasion that the alliance would continue to support the Ukrainian military in its fight to restore its sovereign territory as long as Putin's unprovoked invasion continued. This decision, of course, has led it to offer almost everything short of a direct military intervention. Its members have now trained tens of thousands of Ukrainian military personnel, dating back to 2014. It has committed to train tens of thousands more over the coming years as it invites Ukrainians to participate in large-scale exercises using equipment they are in the process of donating to Ukraine. Ukraine benefits by gaining first-hand insight into how these systems are used in concert, something they will undoubtedly aim to capitalize on as they plan and execute their own counteroffensives in the months to come. People who witness these exercises say they feel different since 2022. The training feels more real. Countries who have not traditionally lived up to their defense commitments are now sending more troops to participate than in the past. Now, challenges synchronizing communications between British Challenger and German Leopard tank crews on the battlefield are taken more seriously, as resolving them may ultimately save many Ukrainian lives. Mechanized tactics take time to master. For Western countries, it can take up to 2 years to blend new units into cohesive fighting forces that have gained proficiency in the tactics, theory, and practice of armored warfare. Ultimately, the provision of Western weapons is only as good as the operators who use them. The Ukrainians are up for the task, but they also have an entire Western brain trust in the NATO alliance to help them get up into higher gear. On paper, in a hypothetical war between NATO and Russia, NATO has the edge in the number of tanks, the edge in infantry fighting and armored vehicles, the edge in MRAPs, the edge in self-propelled and field artillery platforms, the edge in fighter, bomber, support and trainer aircraft, the edge in helicopters, the edge in force reserves, the edge in air-to-air refuelers, the edge in UAVs, the edge in airports, bases, naval fleet strength, and submarines. In just about every conceivable domain, NATO has more. Just about the only area of parity is nuclear capacity. Collectively, NATO possesses just over 6,000 nuclear weapons, virtually the same as Russia. Of these, it has deployed somewhere in the region of 2,400, compared to Russia, which has only deployed 1,500 of its own. Russia does have the edge in tactical nuclear weapons, almost 2,000 of them, to NATO's 500. But if you are going to use a tactical nuke on the battlefield, you might as well scale up to the real thing. And nobody, seemingly not even Putin, wants that. Western analysts were once confident Russian ground forces could rapidly seize Baltic territory, overwhelm NATO's frontier defenses, and seize the capitals of Estonia and Latvia in something like 60 hours. Today, estimates for this type of worst-case scenario have come under serious scrutiny, thanks in part to the measures it has taken to build its collective response capabilities, from integrating new members like Finland, to bolstering its enhanced forward presence and rapid response forces, to conducting extensive annual exercises simulating every avenue of conflict. If somehow war were ever to break out between Russia and the West, the result would almost certainly go exactly as you might expect. But what do you think? If Putin does launch an attack on NATO, will he regret it? Is NATO ready to send Russia's conscripts and clanky tanks running for the hills, or could the bear still cause some serious damage to NATO's member countries? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The United States would absolutely decimate Russia if war broke out between the two nations. That's the opinion of David Petraeus, a former CIA director and four-star army general who says that Russia launching a nuke in Ukraine would lead to the US stomping Putin into submission. But there's a caveat to that claim. Petraeus says that the US would lead NATO in a collective takedown of every conventional Russian force, from battlefield equipment to naval, that is stationed in or around Ukraine. What he doesn't say is that if it was a one-on-one fight between Russia and the US, with all of their individual forces focused solely on each other, that America would come out on top. Would it though? That's an interesting question, as the world's two largest superpowers colliding would inevitably lead to a world war that involves almost every ally that either country could muster. But if we could create a hypothetical battlefield in which the two countries fight alone, would the US have what it takes to defeat Russia? Or does Putin have enough tricks up his sleeve to take on America? Let's find out, starting with the most obvious point: the size of each country's military. According to Global Firepower, the US and Russia rank as numbers 1 and 2 respectively in terms of the sheer size of their militaries. Starting with the United States, it has 1.832 million military personnel, 1.39 million of whom are on active duty and not part of volatile paramilitary groups. The vast majority of that military is focused on the ground-based army, which boasts a little over 1 million members spread across active and reserve duty. But the Air Force and US Navy are no slouches, with both having hundreds of thousands of members. The US also has a ton of equipment. A staggering 13,300 aircraft, with 9,975 of those being combat-ready, join 5,500 tanks and over 300,000 vehicles, along with impressive stocks of artillery. On the naval side, the US has 484 assets, including nearly a dozen aircraft carriers and 92 destroyers. It has nuclear-capable submarines too, making its naval fleet a terrifying force, both on the surface and below it. These are amazing numbers, but Russia isn't too far behind. Global Firepower points out that it has 1.33 million military personnel, with 830,900 of those on active duty. That leaves 250,000 as reserves, and a similar number in paramilitary groups such as the infamous Wagner Group that Moscow essentially controls. In the air, Russia does seem to fall behind substantially. It has 4,182 aircraft, of which Global Firepower estimates around 2,000 are combat ready, and the Russian Air Space Force (VKS) has a few hundred thousand fewer members. Russia also has less military vehicles, 151,000 to America's 300,000, though it comes out on top with tanks, as it has more than double what the US boasts. Its navy is bigger too. Russia has 598 assets that it can call on, though the spread of those assets differs from the United States. It only has one aircraft carrier, for instance, and a comparatively paltry 15 destroyers compared to America's 92. Submarine numbers are about level, though America wins out for nuclear capabilities. But Russia has impressive numbers of corvettes and is likely more capable than the US when it comes to conducting mine warfare. If war were won on pure numbers alone, the US would be the clear victor. It has more of almost everything from personnel to equipment, and even in the naval area, where it lags behind, you could argue that America's focus on more attacking vessels gives it an advantage. But sheer numbers alone don't win wars. Both the US and Russia can tell you that. They have each found it difficult to win wars against much smaller countries, as we saw clearly in Vietnam and are currently seeing in Ukraine. So pure military might isn't the measuring stick for a conflict between the two. We have to dig deeper. Starting with the ground game, both have similar ground force setups. For the US, its infantry squads form the backbone of its armed forces, with its light infantry being divided into air assault, mountain, and airborne units. Each light infantry squad consists of 9 soldiers, divided into a squad leader and a pair of fire teams. Each of those fire teams has a lead, an automatic rifleman, typically carrying M4 carbines and an M249 automatic weapon, a grenadier, and a rifleman. Soldiers may also receive AT-4 anti-tank weapons if the situation calls for it. Mechanize one of those infantry units and you see the addition of both the Stryker and M2 Bradley fighting vehicles. Most interesting here is the new generation of Strykers, which come equipped with either a powerful 30mm cannon or the United States' ace in the hole, the Javelin anti-tank missile. That missile gives the US a mid-range option for taking out tanks that could prove especially useful given Russia's reliance on them as combat vehicles. Russia's equivalent of America's mechanized squads is its motor rifle team, which will typically come equipped with either a BMP-23 or BTR-82A combat vehicle. Those vehicles have 7-man dismount teams, all armed with a pair of PKM machine guns, an AK-74M rifle, and a short-range RPG-16 anti-tank weapon. Those PKMs are starting to get a little dated, though Russia is in the process of switching them out for the updated PKP. However, the motor rifle teams lack a comparable anti-tank weapon to the Javelin, giving the US a slight advantage in that area that would otherwise be more or less equal. However, Russia does come out on top in terms of the sheer number of infantry it can field compared to the United States. Its infantry contains a trio of vehicle platoons, including an extremely mobile airborne unit that enables it to field about 25% more soldiers than the US Army, according to the national interest. Theoretically, that gives Russia more tactical mobility on the ground, especially compared to America's light infantry that is marching on foot. Russia can reach objectives faster and deploy more people when it gets there. But that increased deployment isn't all it's cracked up to be. When Russia loses one of its vehicles, it loses about a third of its combat power that's built into each of its squads. By contrast, the US loses about a quarter because it has so many infantry members already on the ground. Combine that with the Bradley's better armor and superior firepower compared to Russia's BMP, and you have another slight edge for the US. Throw the Javelin into the mix, and the US has more than enough firepower to take on Russia's superior deployment capabilities. Of course, there are caveats on both sides. The first is that neither country's infantry would fight alone. The battle wouldn't be a case of stacking infantry units against one another. Mortars, air support, artillery, and so much more would be added to the mix, meaning that ground-based battles would be determined as much by tactical nous as pure firepower. Terrain is the second caveat, with Russia's effectiveness potentially being curtailed if battles were fought on terrain that favors foot soldiers, given its heavy reliance on vehicles. However, you could also argue that Russia would have the advantage if ground battles were fought in colder climates. And of course, each would have a home field advantage of knowing their territory if the war encroached into their own country. So there are factors at play beyond firepower. Though the US likely comes out on top in a ground war, it's better equipped and has more infantry, even if Russia has superior deployment. We see a similar story when the battle takes to the skies. Here, the US has a clear advantage for the simple fact that each country uses its air force differently. Russia tends to focus on small-scale operations with its air force. It typically uses its planes to offer support to its ground troops, with bombing runs tending to be conducted at low altitudes. That approach creates a great risk of planes being shot down by anti-air artillery, as we've seen to great effect in the Ukraine war. According to the RAND Corporation, Moscow has lost between 84 and 130 of its aircraft by August 2023, with the real number likely being higher. In fact, the same group says that Russia may have lost between 27 and 57 aircraft by simply pushing too many of its aging aircraft into longer service. Maintenance is almost as much of an issue as the caliber of its pilots and the approach it takes to aerial battles. By contrast, the United States focuses on composite air operations, or COMEOs. This approach can bring anywhere between 20 and 100 aircraft into a single operation, usually taking place over a large geographical area to achieve an objective. Those craft will vary, with some providing reconnaissance and support, while others attack more directly, creating a multifaceted approach to air-based warfare that allows the US to not only cover large patches of land, but also fend off other aerial forces. Granted, COMEOs often include aircraft from multiple countries working together to achieve a goal, but it's likely that the US would still employ this approach when fighting Russia on its own, especially given the sheer volume of superior equipment that it has. And equipment is another major win for the US. Russia has a large number of Soviet-era aircraft, including its MiG-29s, MiG-31s, and Su-27s. It also uses Su-30s, which were introduced in 1992, making them over 30 years old. Granted, these craft have generally been modernized as much as possible, making them capable of modern air-based warfare. But they're still old aircraft, with a lot of flight miles recorded and relatively few left in the tank. Of course, these aren't the only craft in Russia's lineup, as they also have the more modern MiG-35 and Su-35 fighters to call on, but neither is as advanced as America's best fighters, and Russia's war in Ukraine has shown that it's increasingly reliant on older craft to conduct its air operations. In comparison, the US largely uses the F-16 and A-10 fighter jets, which have been in operation for about 20 years. They're starting to show their age too, though they don't have as many miles on the clock as Russia's older stock of Soviet-era fighters. However, it's in the process of introducing the F-35A Lightning II into its fleet. A fifth-generation fighter jet, the F-35A would likely be the trump card that America could deploy in an air battle that it should already dominate, simply thanks to its superior tactics. So the battle on the ground is fairly even, but the battle in the skies should be in favor of the United States. That was even pointed out in 2020 by a Russian tech billionaire named Mikhail Bolshakov. In an article published on the Russian news website Vzgliad, he pointed out that Russia does have the Su-57, which it claims is superior to anything that America has to offer, but where production of the Su-57 is faltering at best, America already has 500 F-35s, compared to the tiny squadron of more modern fighters that Russia has at its disposal. There's no use in saying that something is better if that something barely exists. For the United States, it could assume that Russia would deploy similar air tactics to those in Ukraine, and those tactics would represent opportunities given the wealth of anti-aircraft options that the US has compared to the soldiers on the ground in Kyiv. The US is looking pretty good so far, but the battle may start to turn in Russia's favor once the Navy comes into play. After all, Global Firepower's figures from earlier show that Russia's Navy is larger than America's. Though the US is no slouch, yes, it has fewer naval assets, but those assets tend toward being more combat-focused than those deployed by the Russians. Still, you can't underestimate Russia's capabilities in this area. Yes, its Navy focuses primarily on smaller patrol boats and corvettes, neither of which present much of a threat to America in a blue water scenario. The deeper you go into the sea, the more America has the advantage simply because of the strength of its destroyers. However, Russia could play a different naval game. While using some of its large ships and submarines to distract America's bigger combat vessels in deep water, it could deploy its smaller vessels to coastal regions. That would be a problem. Corvettes and patrol vehicles are capable of attacking ports and launching smaller attacks, especially once they've drawn in close to a target. They're also more agile than the larger destroyers, meaning they'd present a clear threat to commercial vessels that aren't equipped to fend off attacks from any type of ship. And though the Pacific Ocean would be a huge barrier to these small ships, Russia's proximity to Alaska, its Providenia port is just 250 miles away, could prove a route in. Attack Alaska, establish it as a naval base, and launch from there. Of course, the US would have something to say about this approach. While that proximity is an issue, it would also create a bottleneck if Russia relied on it alone to get its ship closer to the United States. Its smaller vessels would be sitting ducks for America's fleet of destroyers as they cross the Bering Strait. So that would be unlikely to happen. And according to Marine Insight, there's a good reason why. As with its air force, Russia takes a different approach to the United States with its naval forces. Russia is all about strategic deterrence. It uses its navy primarily to keep others away from Russian territory rather than to actively attack in deeper seas. That's not to say it's incapable of blue water combat. It's just not as capable as the US, which would make using its navy to prevent America from landing in Russia via sea a smarter strategy. The United States, by contrast, relies on power projection and is much more likely to deploy its navy into deep waters to combat Russia. It could also use its fleet as launching points for the Air Force's Comeo attacks, get one of its dozen or so aircraft carriers in close, and American fighter pilots could take to the skies to attack Russian ports or even conduct simple reconnaissance. The only area where the two countries are approximately equal is in nuclear-powered submarine capabilities, and it's here that Russia could claw back some ground. According to Newsweek, Putin has been improving Russia's underwater capabilities for years, with the crown jewels of that fleet being the Imperator Alexander III and the Krasnoyarsk. The former is capable of carrying up to 16 of Russia's Bulava intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, giving it the ability to launch heavy attacks from deep waters onto US territory. Putin has been bullish about his subs too, having said in December that he'll be commissioning more nuclear submarines in the future to ensure Russia's security for decades to come. Of course, the US is no slouch in the nuclear submarine department. All four of its main operation classes of subs, the Virginia, Ohio, Los Angeles, and Seawolf, are all nuclear powered, and in the case of the Ohio class, the US has 14 submarines that are capable of launching ICBMs of their own, according to the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So a naval battle between Russia and the US might come down to where that battle takes place. Deep sea battles seem to favor the US, where more coastal conflicts may be the domain of Russia. Still, the US might have a slight advantage here, simply because it has more aircraft carriers, creating the possibility of better cooperation between its navy and air force. But none of that matters if either country runs out of arms. Assuming the battle between the US and Russia becomes a war of attrition, which is likely, barring one potential outcome that we'll get to in a moment, keeping troops stocked up will be essential. Every destroyed vehicle, sunken ship, and destroyed fighter plane will take its toll, with near-constant military production likely being essential, not to mention all the ammunition and small arms that would be needed for ground combat. Right now, the US stands apart in the arms production race, at least in terms of producing weapons for other countries. According to Axiom, the US produced 40% of the world's arms exports between 2018 and 2022, in addition to keeping its own military well stocked. That's leagues ahead of Russia. Though still in second place, it only accounted for 16% of exports during the same period. Of course, the caveat to these figures is that Russia is engaged in a war with Ukraine right now. It's not selling as many weapons because its own forces need them to fight that war, so it's no shock that the US has leaped further ahead. But further is the key term here. Even before the war in Ukraine, the United States sold and produced more weapons. Between 2013 and 17, the US accounted for 33% of all weapons exports, with Russia hitting 22%. Closer for sure, but there was still a considerable gap there. It's an inexact measure of production capacity. And it's not like Russia doesn't have the ability to ramp up when it needs to. As recently as September 2023, Reuters reported that Putin has ordered a cranking up of production to keep Russian troops well equipped, even in the face of increasingly strict sanctions being placed on Moscow. According to Bekan Ozdoev, who is the industrial director of Rostec, which manufactures most of the country's weapons, production of various types of weapons has increased to between 2 and 10 times previous numbers. He also pointed to increased production of tanks, rocket launchers, artillery, and ballistic missiles, all of which should be harder to produce given the sanctions placed on Rostec. Even the United States Treasury recognizes how important Rostec is to Russia, dubbing it the cornerstone of Russia's defense, industrial, technological, and manufacturing sectors. With Rostec firing on all cylinders, Russia would be able to keep pumping out weapons simply because it's a state-controlled corporation that Moscow ultimately controls. The US doesn't have that luxury. Its weapons come from private companies that are under government contracts. If Russia were to really fire on all cylinders with its weapon production, could the US match it, or would it get wrapped up in bureaucratic red tape and contract negotiations that could delay its weapons production? It's hard to say. But ultimately, the production lines won't matter if either country launches the biggest weapons in their arsenal, the nukes. Russia and the US lead the way in nuclear weapons, and it's not even close. According to the Arms Control Association, ACA, Russia has an estimated 5,889 nukes to America's 5,244, giving it a slight edge. Of those nukes, Russia has strategically deployed 1,549 of them, while the United States has 1,410 ready to go. The reality is that Russia having a slight edge in numbers here is ultimately meaningless. Both countries have more than enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other many times over, meaning mutually assured destruction would come to fruition if either was brave or stupid enough to launch. Still, there is an element that might tip the balance in Russia's favor from the nuclear perspective: the RS-28 Sarmat. Dubbed the Satan II by some military experts, the Sarmat missile system entered combat duty in September 2023 and can launch nuclear warheads further than any ICBM of its kind. Its range is somewhere in the 11,000-mile region, with Moscow claiming that each missile can carry 15 warheads. Washington disputes that. It claims the number is closer to 10, but it's the range that's the really worrying part. Russia can launch a nuke from almost anywhere and hit the US. America doesn't have that capability. Its closest equivalent to the Sarmat, the Minuteman III, can travel up to 8,000 miles, according to the National Air and Space Museum. Impressive for sure, and far enough to reach Russia, but the ICBM is outdated compared to the Sarmat. Furthermore, the US Naval Institute reports that America has only tested the Minuteman III's range up to 6,000 miles, meaning 8,000 may be a stretch for the aging ICBM. Even the Minuteman III's intended replacement doesn't outperform the Sarmat when it comes to sheer range. The upcoming LGM-35A Sentinel isn't complete yet, so its specifications aren't public knowledge. However, Air Force Technology estimates that the ICBM is expected to have a range exceeding 5,500 kilometers, which is about 3,400 miles. That's less distance than the Minuteman III and about a third of the range of the Sarmat, which would put the US at a nuclear disadvantage. The caveat here is that exceeding 5,500 kilometers could mean that the Sentinel could go much further. We just don't know yet. The key is that Russia can now fire from land almost anywhere in the world and hit the US with a nuke. Of course, America's air and nuclear submarine options mean it could launch a counterattack at any time, potentially making the point moot. The only thing for sure is that if one country went down the nuclear route, the other wouldn't be far behind. The entire world would suffer the consequences. With nukes in play, the battle between the US and Russia could come down to which is willing to fire first. But if we take nuclear weapons out of the equation, it's clear that the US, by and large, has the advantage. It has more troops, more equipment, and a far more advanced air force that is not only tactically superior, but equipped with better aircraft. On the naval front, the battle is a little more even. Though the US has a stronger attacking force, particularly in deep waters, the smaller boats in the Russian fleet grant it more mobility in coastal areas. And so we come back to the question that kicked off this video. Could the US beat Russia on its own? The answer is probably yes, assuming Russia is fighting on its own as well. Bring Russia's allies into the fray and you may have a whole different story. But what do you think? Does Moscow have tricks up its sleeve that would help it to overcome the sheer firepower that the US has available? Or perhaps there are weaknesses in tactics or equipment that would mean the US isn't quite as strong as it appears to be? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Going into war isn't always a choice. More often than not, it's a necessity. And even with NATO's support of Ukrainian independence, it seems like Putin is leaving the US less and less choice in the decision of whether or not to get more actively involved in the war in Ukraine. But if the US had to suddenly engage in a full-scale war against Russia, how would it fare? What plans is it making for such an eventuality? One thing is for sure, Putin had better buckle up. The US military keeps its M1 Abrams oiled up, its Tomahawks loaded, and its Star-Spangled Heroes capes nearby all year round. It is always prepared and has kept a particularly close watch on the former Soviet Union ever since the 1940s. During the Cold War, the West had it easy. Despite communist coups and the proxy wars, the Americans and their NATO allies always knew exactly who the real threat was, the foe pulling the strings behind the scenes, if you will. It was, of course, the Soviet Union. For 45 years, the West had prepared, strategized, and planned for the ultimate eventuality, an all-out military confrontation with the Soviet superpower. Whether the Cold War conflict went hot by spiraling into the nuclear realm, or if kinetic operations remained firmly moored in the familiar bounds of conventional warfare, made little difference. What mattered most was that the enemy and its intentions were clear. Knowing that is half the battle. But what happened next changed everything. The Soviet collapse in the early 1990s kick-started 3 decades of self-discovery as the US spread its wings as the world's sole superpower. Combating terrorists, genocidal dictators, and non-state tyrants became the order of the day. NATO members drifted apart, the alliance's mission and purpose suddenly cast into doubt. Then came a 2-decade forever war in the Middle East. We all know how that turned out. After a decade of strategic revision, the US finally embarked on a wholesale pivot to Asia, now hoping to contain a Chinese threat which had for decades grown stronger, almost in plain sight. And then February 2022 happened. Russia invaded Ukraine. Geopolitical clarity, it seemed, was restored. The aggressive Russian bear, whose foreign policy since the Soviet collapse had vacillated somewhere between bitter Western resentment and surprising Western rapprochement, showed its true colors. America, firmly committed to bolstering its presence in the Indo-Pacific, nevertheless seized the opportunity in Europe. For years it had been nursing its wounds, trying to restore European partnerships and alliances which had slowly atrophied under the pressure of populist politics. The invasion recast these relationships in stone. Everyone in the Western world suddenly saw the reflection of their own histories in Ukraine's existential fight for its independence. The US and its Western allies pledged collective action: sanctions, hybrid warfare, material donations, refugee support, and military training. Everything short of entering the fight themselves. This Western support coalition has shown no signs of weakening now, more than a year into the war. If Finland's recent accession to NATO says anything, it has only grown stronger. What is this all leading to? For the Americans, who for a decade could not drum up the political unity required to deal with Russian revisionism, the Russian threat is credible once more. The pivot to Asia will continue apace, but now, with Eastern European sovereignty under threat once more, America must continue to do everything in its power to prepare it and its European allies for the ultimate eventuality, a full-scale war with Russia. We know you're probably laughing right about now. War with Russia, you're saying. The same Russia that can barely make inroads against a country 28 times smaller and with 100 million fewer people than itself. The same Russia that has allegedly already suffered 250,000 casualties in a single year of fighting, more than the entire number of Russian soldiers killed in every war the Soviet Union and Russia fought since World War II combined. Well, yeah, that Russia. As counterintuitive as it now seems, Russia still poses a grave threat to Eurasian security and Western values the world over. Western analysts are contemplating a number of contingencies that could result from the war in Ukraine, which fortunately for us all has thus far remained contained to a single country. The major one is the potentiality that Russia and its fuming dictator Vladimir Putin, finally recognizing the futility of winning a long-term victory in Ukraine, go absolutely rogue. Russia has all but burned its remaining capital with the West. Politically, Putin is a global pariah. Economically, Russia has been cut off from Western markets. Its once profitable natural gas left with virtually nowhere to go. Sanctions continue to cut into its ability to supply its military and civilian population with the specialized industrial and technological parts it needs to function effectively. Militarily, there's little evidence the latest round of mobilization will provide the tactical momentum Russia needs to win over the long term. Rather, it's more likely that untrained Russian conscripts or mobiks will continue to be fed into the meat grinder to little effect. Will Putin back down? You can almost guarantee he won't. He's already raised the stakes too high. His people, his propagandists at least, expect too much of him. He's paranoid. He must deliver on his promises. The Ukrainians, as long as they live and breathe, will never accept the Russian occupation on any scale. As a final recourse, Putin still has his nuclear umbrella, something he knows the West won't gamble on. From our vantage point today, it seems as though Putin's Russia, if it continues its present course, will almost have to go rogue. It won't end the war with a negotiated settlement unless something drastic changes, but as attrition whittles down its once vaunted military power, it will be forced to engage in its antebellum tactics, only far more aggressively. It will rely on asymmetric warfare and hybrid operations to destabilize the West. It will increasingly act like a global version of its now closest remaining ally of consequence, Iran, completely decoupled from the international community, pursuing a revanchist foreign policy using drones, proxy wars, missile strikes, espionage, and more, all while using its nuclear umbrella to deter Western retaliation. Nuclear threats will continue to grow in intensity. Cyber operations will increase in kind. Putin will target vulnerable pipelines and transoceanic fiber optic cables. Russia will continue to fund and sponsor disinformation and misinformation campaigns. Russian bots named Peter and Frank will enter your feeds at election times in the hopes of trolling you into voting for their candidate of choice. The bloodletting in Ukraine will continue. The threat of escalation will remain omnipresent. And that isn't good, because as one think tank put it, a rogue Russia still represents a geopolitical crisis of the highest order. It's a threat to global security, Western political systems, the cybersphere, space, and food security, not to mention every Ukrainian civilian. Let's be clear, Ukraine has blunted, if not outright neutered, Russia's conventional military power over the past year. That feat alone is remarkable. But this war won't end anytime soon. Russia remains a dangerous foe, and elsewhere, especially outside Ukraine, the bear can still bite. Make no mistake. So where, outside Ukraine, could the US see itself fighting Russia, and how would it do so? One of the geopolitical hotspots for a possible confrontation between Russia and the US is in a random chunk of territory wedged between Lithuania and Poland, known as the Kaliningrad exclave. This sparsely populated patch of land is Russia's gateway to the Baltic, a heavily defended former German port city ceded to the Soviets in the aftermath of World War II. Kaliningrad's geography is tricky. The port is literally surrounded by NATO countries. Strategically, it's an A2AD, or anti-access area denial nightmare for NATO. Home to thousands of Russian forces, advanced fighter jets, and nuclear-capable Iskander-M missiles, the exclave is connected to Belarus by a narrow 40-mile land bridge known as the Suwalki Gap, which itself cuts into the only two highways and lone railroad connecting Poland to NATO's exposed Baltic states. Since NATO assets cannot traverse the Suwalki Gap without coming under the guns of Russia's military in Kaliningrad, the wide-open rural region is a crucial choke point that Russia would almost certainly exploit if it ever sought to cut off the Baltics from NATO. Finland's accession to NATO has caused tensions in this region to flare once more. In a matter of 1 year, NATO's border with Russia has doubled, adding over 800 miles of densely wooded, difficult-to-patrol tundra. The Baltic Sea has come firmly under NATO's protection, with Kaliningrad the only Russian outpost in an otherwise Western-friendly sea of states. Putin has had grievances against the West for years, and nobody, certainly not now, should bother trying to predict his next move. But prediction and preparation is the express job of America's military strategists. Were Putin to try to secure the Suwalki Gap to Kaliningrad or gain a foothold in Finland, Lithuania, Estonia, or any of its past satellites, the US and its allies must try to discern his regional capabilities and prepare for an open conflict. But what would this look like? How does the Russian way of war differentiate from the American approach? America is fortunate, at least far more fortunate than Russia in this hypothetical. Its robust network of military alliances and partnerships throughout Europe mean it will be far from alone in a war against Russia. Before the war in Ukraine, both Russia and NATO had respected the terms of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, committing both sides to avoid reinforcing or permanently stationing forces on the territories of the former Warsaw Pact states or their neighboring Russian borders. Russia abrogated itself from these terms when it invaded Ukraine. Now, NATO has a clear pathway to bolster its presence in these critical areas using measured multinational deployments and the increased rotation of permanently based American troops. The fact America's force posture would be complemented by the presence of British, Polish, Italian, Spanish, French, Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, Finnish, and many other allied partners speaks to the logic of the American way of war, which in the modern era has become multinational and collaborative to the core. There is strength in numbers and resolve in collective resilience. These force multipliers are not something Russia could count on in a direct confrontation with NATO. In fact, it can only really count on direct, cooperative assistance from Belarus, and amid its attempts to keep out of the Ukraine war, Belarusian loyalty to Russia is an especially unproven commodity. While Russia has struggled to coax Belarus to fight alongside it, NATO's military personnel now exceeds 5.4 million, 4 times that of Russia. According to Statista, NATO also has about 5 times as many aircraft, 4 times as many armored vehicles, and 3 times as many military ships. Not to mention the backing of the world's biggest defense spender, the US itself, with 1.39 million troops alone, and a defense budget of $801 billion in 2021, dwarfing second-place China with a net spend of $293 billion, and Russia, who spent a paltry $65.9 billion that same year. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, each year it conducted massive, multi-day military exercises demonstrating its military power. NATO has done the same, ramping up its collective exercises over the past year in response to Russian aggression. While these exercises show little more than NATO's theoretical military effectiveness, the war in Ukraine has brought Russia into stark relief, and it has certainly been found wanting. Russia is in the midst of a new military reform, something its Ministry of Defense announced at the end of 2022. Most see this as little more than a haphazard attempt to patch a sinking ship. They're trying to grow their modern military to the size it was over 2 decades ago. But today there remains a lack of specialists in charge of maintaining military equipment and vehicles, as well as military infrastructure inherited from the USSR, which no longer exists today. Additionally, there were tens of thousands of auxiliary positions like military financial officers and army construction workers, which have also ceased to exist. In other words, noted Russian military journalist and military analyst Pavel Felgenauer, the nominal size of the armed forces cannot be increased in a realistic and meaningful way. Russia lacks qualified junior officers. There's nobody to command the conscripts they're throwing into battle. The army of 1.5 million soldiers Russia dreams of is little more than a bureaucratic fantasy. Still, Russia is frantically trying to restore its depleted forces to the numbers it boasted prior to the invasion of Ukraine. It isn't working. Its armed forces today are lacking in some areas of modern military technology, including drone capability, electronic components, and radar and satellite reconnaissance, Felgenauer told the media. Yes, we have weapons, but our reconnaissance capabilities are weaker than our attack capabilities. So we have a long-range, sometimes precision-guided weapon, but we don't always know where the target is. But what if Russia went into a full-scale war with the West despite these obvious weaknesses? Let's say for the sake of argument that Putin goes rogue. He sees Finland's NATO membership as the final straw. He still doubts the West will risk starting World War III, and he is desperate for a quick victory in Europe. He throws everything into the Ukrainian cauldron, and it all goes wrong. Armed with Western tanks and eventually aircraft, Ukraine mounts a series of counteroffensives that all but push back Russia to its own borders. Decisively defeated on the battlefield, the enemies of Lukashenko's pro-Russian faction in Belarus stage a coup and oust the leader from power. In the cascading crisis, weathered Belarusian volunteers, which for years had fought in Ukraine, return home and help throw the Russians out of their homeland. Belarus thus switched sides, leaving the Russian garrison at Kaliningrad entirely surrounded by enemy forces. The Suwalki Gap is no longer a concern for the West, but it is for Russia. Over time, Poland, Lithuania, and other NATO countries pressure the Russian garrison to demilitarize. Morale sinks. They are at the whims of NATO naval forces in the Baltic, Swedish missiles on the neighboring island of Gotland, and all but blocked from their homeland. Putin decides the time is ripe to present NATO with a sort of final act. He invades Belarus and, hoping to regain a foothold in Eastern Europe, Putin decides to test NATO's resolve, launching an attack on the Suwalki Gap and small villages along the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian borders. He uses Kaliningrad's Iskander missiles and naval missile corvettes to cover his advance. With the bulk of its reserve forces in Poland and Finland, Putin's forces overwhelm the unprepared NATO multinational garrison in Estonia, which is briefly forced into retreat. Russia immediately begins reinforcing its positions, bracing for the inevitable counterattack as NATO triggers Article 5. NATO's tripwire strategy to place small forward presence battalion-sized deployments in the Baltic to absorb a Russian invasion while it rushed its reserves to the front could not prevent Estonia from coming under Russian control. Latvia looks like it will hold, but only just. But once Estonia fell, all of NATO's Baltic states, supported by its European, American, and Canadian allies, converged. The West has wargamed this scenario over and over again, and Russian units immediately feel pressure from NATO's Response Force and Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, a multinational brigade on a constant state of alert. The initial surge into the Baltics is complicated by Russian missile attacks on roads, bridges, and railways. The US and NATO respond by establishing air superiority over Estonia at high risk to itself, beginning with a massive cyber attack and cruise missile strikes launched by a fleet of B-52s on Russian SAM sites that overwhelm their air defenses. Learning the lessons of the Ukraine war, NATO targets Russia's vulnerable logistics infrastructure supplying its forward Estonian presence. Superior commercial satellites, drone technology, UAVs, electromagnetic capabilities, and next-generation precision-guided munitions fired by interoperable F-35 fighters enable NATO forces to target railway hubs supplying Putin's war in a way the Ukrainians never could. Once Russia gave up their air to NATO and the US, it was essentially game over. Kaliningrad, isolated and completely surrounded, capitulates in a matter of days. NATO continues to pour manpower and material into Estonia at a rate unmatched by Russia. Its theater assets are better maintained. It has higher morale, reinforced by a clear sense of mission. It suffers fewer casualties, a result of superior airlift capabilities and hospital facilities. It engages in full-spectrum multi-domain operations, or the simultaneous attack from sea, air, land, and cyberspace, unleashing a single symphony of violence to break down advanced defenses. It has been trained for years. Through it all, NATO member countries shoulder a fair share of the burden, thus proving the NATO concept. Russian morale breaks under a withering, round-the-clock assault. The war is over in a matter of weeks. Russian forces beat a hasty retreat to Moscow, and Putin's world comes crashing down as his people, fired up after years of disappointment, global isolation, bloodshed, and military setbacks, finally turn on him. Sure, it's all hypothetical, and yes, it's fair to claim that the West has struggled against forces far weaker than the conventional peers they would face in the Baltics over the past few decades. A fair criticism, but one equally applicable to nearly every country immersed in counterinsurgencies and irregular warfare. It's hard to believe that Russia could ever succeed in an out-and-out military confrontation against the West all on its own. If the West applies the full weight of its collective military capabilities on a clearly defined enemy, the outcome for Putin would be very, very bad indeed. His only recourse, again, would be to threaten the world with nuclear destruction. Would he really go that far? What do you think? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
The US would come to Taiwan's aid if China attacked. That's the most common scenario for the wargame simulation. For the last decades, China has been rising and making it clear that Taiwan should undoubtedly be its territory. At the same time, it is seductive to ask, could the US conquer China on its own? More and more governments are looking to war as an effective way to resolve long-standing conflicts, and tensions between the US and China are rising from time to time. Let's start with analyzing the nuclear arsenal. In accordance with the March 2023 New START Declaration, the United States possesses 1,419 strategic nuclear warheads that are distributed across 662 strategic delivery systems, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers. In accordance with the New START Treaty, the United States and the Russian Federation are required to conduct semi-annual exchanges of information regarding treaty-accountable items. Additionally, the United States maintains an approximate inventory of 100 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs, which are forward deployed at 6 NATO bases located in 5 European countries. These bases include Aviano and Gedi in Italy, Buchel in Germany, Incirlik in Turkey, Kleine Brogel in Belgium, and Volkel in the Netherlands. On October 5, 2021, the US State Department released a declassification announcement revealing that the total count of both active and inactive US warheads stood at 3,750 as of September 2020. It's worth noting that these figures exclude retired warheads and those awaiting dismantlement. According to the Federation of American Scientists, FAS, the current military stockpile is estimated to consist of 3,708 warheads, with an additional 1,536 retired warheads awaiting dismantlement. Consequently, the total number of warheads as of early 2023 is estimated to be 5,244. Big number, right? Actually, this figure signifies a huge decrease in the stockpile compared to its peak of 31,255 at the conclusion of the 1967 fiscal year. What about the Chinese nuclear arsenal? Managing the count of nuclear warheads in China poses greater challenges. Over the past few decades, China has consistently modernized its nuclear capabilities, with a significant expansion in both the number and variety of weapons deployed in recent years. As of November 2022, the Defense Department's assessment suggests that China might possess as many as 1,000 deployable nuclear warheads by the year 2030. According to independent researchers, China could now have approximately 410 operational warheads ready for deployment across 218 strategic delivery systems, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and nuclear-capable bombers. China is currently in the process of constructing a new generation of submarines equipped for carrying nuclear warheads, with the utilization of Russian technology playing a significant role in their development. The incorporation of Russian technology is expected to enhance the submarine's stealth capabilities, making them considerably more challenging to detect and track. A study conducted by the China Institute of Maritime Studies at the US Naval War College has underscored the potentially profound implications of these upgraded Chinese submarines for the United States and its allies in the Indian Ocean. Analysts and defense experts suggest that the creation of these advanced Type 096 nuclear submarines may be finalized by the end of this decade. Christopher Carlson, a naval intelligence analyst, has described the new 096 submarines as a nightmare due to their anticipated extreme difficulty in detection. So what would a nuclear war between these two countries look like? Forecasting the scenarios of a nuclear war between the US and China shows that in the absence of the decisive influence of other factors, there would be no winners in such a battle. The exchange of even a dozen nuclear strikes would have a huge impact on international security and the ecology of the affected territories. Hundreds of thousands of people would die. The fact that nuclear weapons are used would lead to increased escalation and retaliation, and the spiral of violence and death will only grow. The use of hundreds of warheads would cause the destruction of the foundations of the existence of the modern world, its economy and nature. If the US and China decide to use all their nuclear warheads, the result would be sub-zero temperatures within a few years, and most of the planet's population would die of starvation or disease. That is why most experts avoid the prospect of using nuclear weapons during such a conflict. At the same time, there are opinions that China may be able to use it if it feels it poses a significant threat to its own security. During war, the leaders do not always think rationally. In general, the USA has the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and China has the third, but the usage would be a loss for both sides. Okay, the mutual destruction by nuclear weapons is obvious, but who is stronger in other types of armed forces? Let's begin with the Air Force. The modern air power of the United States Armed Forces stands unrivaled, boasting a formidable fleet of over 13,000 aircraft across various categories, with over 5,000 of those just in the Air Force. China can only dream about such a number. This comprehensive inventory encompasses combat and direct attack aircraft, alongside a substantial complement of transport planes, aerial refuelers, specialized mission platforms, and training aircraft, including both fixed-wing and rotary-wing models. Through ongoing modernization efforts, select Cold War-era aircraft have been effectively adapted for contemporary battlefield demands. Additionally, the US Air Force has made significant strides in its commitment to next-generation platforms like the F-22 and the F-35. The US Air Force remains unique in its possession of a dedicated bomber fleet capable of conducting conventional and nuclear missions. Furthermore, its Special Mission Force excels in various specialized airborne operations, offering invaluable support to Allied aircraft and ground commanders. The US Navy maintains an expansive carrier force, enabling it to project power and engage adversaries worldwide effectively. Yes, US troops are everywhere in the world. The US Marine Corps boasts an impressive array of aircraft, rivaling and often surpassing the capabilities of top-tier international air services. US Army aviation is anchored by a vast rotorcraft fleet, featuring the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter and the UH-60 Black Hawk as prominent examples. A breakdown of the US Air Force's composition reveals that nearly 25% are combat direct attack aircraft, close to 40% are rotorcraft helicopters, 7.4% constitute the transport fleet, 18.4% are dedicated to training, and 9.4% serve in special missions and other roles. The most popular models are Boeing AH-64 Apaches 808, Lockheed F-16 Fighting Falcons 775, Sikorsky SH-60 Seahawks 508, Northrop T-38 Talon 497, Raytheon T-6 Texan IIs 445, Boeing CH-47 Chinook 394, Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker 388, Airbus UH-72 Lakota 367, Lockheed F-35 Lightning II 310. Discussing the future strategy of the United States Air Force is a crucial and high-stakes topic. The 2022 National Defense Strategy underscores the importance of deterrence through denial, urging the Department of Defense to explore asymmetric approaches and enhance its posture of denial to discourage potential aggression, particularly in scenarios where adversaries might attempt swift territorial acquisition. The debate at hand within the broader discussion centers on how to implement this approach, with two prevailing schools of thought. The first school of thought emphasizes the significance of air superiority and the capability to overcome China's air force as vital elements in achieving effective deterrence. The second line of thought advocates a defensive strategy. Let's take a look at the Chinese Air Force next and see how they compare to the US. Upon closer examination, Chinese air power reveals a predominant reliance on a copy-and-paste approach for many of its frontline combat assets, comprising a total of 3,044 units, or only a little over half of the US Air Force's 5,000 aircraft. These Chinese entries predominantly originate from Soviet, Russian, French, Israeli, or American sources, with few genuinely domestically developed products to highlight. Although their overall quality and battlefield effectiveness remain largely unproven, the Chinese military can boast significant quantities to deploy in the event of a full-scale conflict. The foundation of modern Chinese air power is primarily attributed to contributions from the former Soviet Union, modern Russia, and more recently, France. A breakdown of the Chinese Air Force's composition reveals that 47.5% are combat direct attack aircraft, almost 40% are rotorcraft helicopters, 8.8% constitute the transport fleet, 12.3% are dedicated to training, and 3.4% serve in special missions and other roles. The most popular models are Chengdu J-7 Fishcan 387, Shenyang J-11 Flanker L 315, Milhai 17 HIP 242, Chengdu J-10 Firebird 235, Harbin Z-9 175, Hongdu JL-8 170, Zhan H-6 120, Chang Z-10 106. As you can see, it's not so impressive compared to the US. Does this mean the US would ultimately beat China in an aerial battle? In the event of a conflict, the foremost objective of the US Air Force would be to wrest air superiority from China. Simultaneously, it is essential to weaken Chinese forces by employing precision strikes from a considerable distance. When the pivotal moment arises, the Air Force can execute a sudden, forceful shift to offensive air superiority, akin to wielding a swift and decisive retribution. To attain air superiority, American forces will need to target China's robust, integrated air defense systems, including critical assets within the mainland, such as air bases, radar installations, air defense assets, and potentially command and control centers. Conversely, China's primary aim is to maintain control over its airspace. Their strategy centers on denying access to their airspace to limit the US's capacity to achieve and utilize air superiority for offensive military operations. This approach allows for resource preservation by employing a substantial quantity of smaller, cost-effective weapons distributed across various locations. The defender of airspace aims to endure the initial air and missile strikes from the adversary and subsequently contest control over the airspace. Conversely, the attacker seeking air superiority against modern air defense systems must overcome multiple layers of defense across various ranges and altitudes. The advantage clearly lies with the defending side. Attempting to breach heavily fortified Chinese airspace would likely result in significant losses. If a US endeavor to secure air superiority and swiftly defeat Chinese invasion forces proves unsuccessful, it could lead to a catastrophic defeat that jeopardizes the Air Force's ability to sustain a defensive war of attrition. These factors collectively erode deterrence. China deploys a mix of Russian-manufactured and domestically produced air defense systems, with the capability to track and engage enemy aircraft. The technological sophistication of these weapons, coupled with their potential for upgrades, presents significant challenges for the United States in its quest for air superiority in a large-scale engagement. China's air defense arsenal includes the formidable Russian-built S-300 and S-400 surface-to-air missile systems, renowned for their effectiveness worldwide. These systems can undergo upgrades to enhance their capabilities further. The latest iterations of the S-400 and upcoming Russian S-500 missiles are interconnected thanks to high-speed computer processing that enables precise, long-range threat detection. These systems offer extended range and heightened sensitivity compared to their predecessors. However, it's important to note that the ability to detect the presence of an aircraft in the sky doesn't guarantee continuous tracking or successful engagement of the aircraft. China's air defense threat extends beyond Russia's built systems, as the People's Liberation Army Air Force complements them with domestically developed systems. China operates its indigenous HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles and is actively working on the HQ-19 missile systems, designed to counter ballistic missile warheads. As a result, any potential aerial assault over mainland China would likely require aircraft to operate at higher altitudes to avoid detection by air defense. Alternatively, unmanned systems could be employed for target reconnaissance, or long-range ballistic and cruise missiles fired from land or sea platforms could be utilized to neutralize Chinese air defenses from safer standoff distances, minimizing the exposure of manned aircraft to enemy fire. So the US is unlikely to be able to achieve control over the air by conventional means due to China's advanced air defense system. It would just be too expensive. The losses would be huge, and it's not a fact that the USA would be ready to take them. Upon scrutinizing the Russian-Ukraine conflict, military experts from various nations recognize the escalating significance of drones in future warfare. The United States is progressively incorporating more drones into its strategic planning. The objective is to compel China to expend costly missiles to eliminate a plethora of inexpensive and readily available UAVs. Drones are poised to enhance reconnaissance capabilities, neutralize air defense systems, target naval vessels, and deplete enemy resources more effectively. Concurrently, China is actively advancing its drone programs and scaling up production efforts. In alignment with this trend, a new strategy within the US Air Force proposes a pivotal role for drones, operating in coordination with fighter aircraft. The US Space Force envisions drones not as independent combat units but as integral components of the Air Force's Collaborative Combat Aircraft initiative. In this concept, a manned fighter is accompanied by an AI-equipped and armed drone, designed to be cost-effective and capable of autonomous and paired operations. The outcome of a potential drone confrontation between the United States and China remains uncertain, but these unmanned systems possess the potential to yield significant advantages and disadvantages for both sides. And what about the trial weapon? Army ground forces. US ground forces are undergoing a comprehensive modernization effort to align with the demands of contemporary warfare, moving away from Cold War-era doctrines toward a more agile and mobile fighting force. The US Army's composition comprises 416,504 units, categorized into various types: 361,127 utility and engineering vehicles, 44,124 infantry fighting vehicles, 4,657 combat tanks, 3,000 air defense units, 2,322 artillery SP, and 1,267 artillery towed. At the forefront of advancing ground forces is the M1 Abrams main battle tank, MBT, renowned as one of the heaviest modern tanks. Weighing between 57 and 61 tons, the Abrams is equipped with multi-layer composite armor, which incorporates depleted uranium for its high-density properties and operates on gas turbine engines running on jet fuel. Because of this, of course, the speed of the vehicle suffers. a little more than 41 miles per hour. This American tank has been in service with the US Army since 1980. The latest iteration, the M1A2 SEP variant, features advanced computerization, thermal imaging, and GPS systems for remote weapon control. The Abrams tank has played pivotal roles in conflicts such as Operation Desert Storm, Enduring Freedom, and Iraqi Freedom. Multiple Abrams tank modifications exist to meet diverse operational needs. Additionally, the M2 Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle, IFV, is a staple in the US military's inventory. This American-tracked IFV, produced by BAE Systems Land and Armaments, features a conventional IFV layout, with the engine transmission compartment at the front and the infantry compartment in the rear hull. Its crew comprises a commander, gunner, and mechanic driver, and the BMP is capable of carrying up to 7 paratroopers. The M2 Bradley boasts an aluminium body and laminated armor, providing protection against 0.57-inch caliber bullets. It is armed with a 0.98-inch M242 automatic cannon and 2 BGM-71 TOW launchers, which demonstrated its prowess in countering Soviet tanks during the Persian Gulf War. An essential addition to the US military is the Stryker, which has expanded its presence due to its versatility across a range of battlefield roles. General Dynamics Land Systems manufactures the Stryker armored combat vehicle, which has been in service since 2002. With 350 horsepower, the Stryker achieves a range of 329 miles and a speed of 38.5 miles an hour. It can accommodate 2 crew members and 9 passengers, with the driver being able to switch between 8x4 on-road and 8x8 off-road modes. Various weapon systems can be mounted on the Stryker, such as the 12.7 M2 Browning machine gun or the Mark 19 grenade launcher. Moreover, the Stryker is equipped with a V-shaped bottom and Mexus modular composite armor capable of withstanding 12.7 caliber bullets. The US military is also incorporating an expanding fleet of wheeled vehicles, drawing from experiences in urban warfare in Afghanistan and Iraq. As we can see, the US has significant forces. But what about China? In the historical context, the Chinese land forces have traditionally relied on the Soviet Union and later Russia as their primary sources for military hardware, with recent diversification including Western support, notably from France. An increasingly noteworthy trend is the development of indigenous Chinese solutions to meet local requirements across a spectrum of categories, including main battle tanks, armored fighting vehicles, artillery systems, multiple rocket launchers, and security vehicles. In total, the Chinese land forces maintain and operate a substantial fleet of nearly 200,000 armored and unarmored vehicles, alongside a considerable artillery force, solidifying their position among the world's top 4 land forces. This inventory encompasses 121,300 utility and engineering vehicles, 17,020 armored fighting vehicles, 5,015 combat tanks, and 4,591 artillery pieces. The Type 96, initially designed as the Type 88C, represents a key component of the People's Liberation Army's tank forces and was a main battle tank introduced into service in 1997. Its development commenced shortly after the conclusion of the Gulf War in 1991. The Type 96 marked a milestone as the first Chinese tank equipped with a 4.92 inches smoothbore gun and automatic loader. The tank features a forced liquid-cooled diesel engine generating 1,000 horsepower, facilitating a maximum speed of 40 miles per hour. Its main gun is an unlicensed copy of the Russian 2A46M, boasting a barrel length of 48 calibers. The ammunition capacity stands at 42 rounds, with 22 of these stored in an automatic loader mechanism akin to the T-72 design. The PLA ground force is extensively mechanized, equipped with a variety of armored platforms, advanced electronic warfare capabilities, concentrated firepower, and modern weapon systems that hold their own against their Western counterparts. But machines of war are nothing without people. So let's talk about the manpower of armies next. The United States has a population of 337,341,954, with a manpower pool of 148,430,460 individuals. The total number of military personnel is 1,832,000. Comprising 1,390,000 in active military service and 442,000 in reserve. The US military enforces a stringent selection process for candidates. Despite its rigor, it serves as the largest employer, providing soldiers with competitive salaries and comprehensive benefits. Eligible Americans can begin their military service at the age of 17, with an age limit of 42. Upon successful testing and evaluation, candidates sign contracts ranging from 2 to 6 years. Strict physical fitness requirements, assessed through the Army Physical Fitness Test (APFT), are pivotal during the candidate selection process. This test includes 35 push-ups, 50 abdominal exercises in 2 minutes, and a 2-mile (3.2 kilometers) cross-country run within 16.5 minutes. This test is mandatory not only for recruits but also for active military personnel, who must take the APFT every 2 years. The standards may slightly vary with age, and individuals in excellent physical condition are subject to specific criteria, which are outlined in a separate document. For instance, a man with a height of 5.58 feet should not exceed a maximum weight of 180 pounds, and for women of the same height, the limit is 161 pounds. Moreover, all candidates must undergo a mandatory background check to ensure a clean legal history, maintain a strong credit record, and have no visible tattoos. China, with its vast population of 1 billion people, boasts one of the world's largest standing armies, totaling around 3.1 million personnel across standard service branches, Army, Navy, and Air Force. This includes over 2 million active personnel, constituting over 60% of the available manpower. In the event of conflict, China's substantial population provides a deep pool of potential recruits, enabling a strategy of attrition warfare through sheer numerical strength. The Chinese military utilizes a range of small arms such as pistols, submachine guns, rifles, sniper rifles, machine guns, and mortars, in addition to portable battlefield solutions, including anti-aircraft and anti-tank missile systems. The People's Liberation Army sets specific requirements for aspiring recruits. Chinese military leaders emphasize the importance of maintaining an image of the most experienced and disciplined armed forces. Obese military personnel may face limitations on career progression, motivating constant physical improvement. The Chinese military promotes physical fitness through numerous competitions among its ranks. An intriguing restriction introduced in 2006 bans individuals who snore consistently from joining China's military academies, as it's believed that such snoring can disrupt the daily activities of other cadets and hinder their military training. Clearly, these vast armies are not simply transported and deployed on land without careful planning. Aviation and the Navy play a crucial role in facilitating the arrival and landing of tens of thousands of troops and equipment. Therefore, let's examine the critical component for such operations, the naval fleets. The US Navy's carrier fleet sets it apart significantly from its regional rivals. At the forefront are 10 nuclear-powered carriers from the Nimitz class, which, while rooted in Cold War concepts and technologies, have led the service to invest heavily in the new Gerald R. Ford class, promising to enhance US naval capabilities. Currently, only one of these supercarriers is in active service. Additionally, the carrier force is supplemented by straight-deck amphibious assault ships, primarily designed for rotorcraft operations, but also capable of supporting fixed-wing strike aircraft like the AV-8B and advanced F-35 VTOL aircraft. The attack submarine fleet consists of all-nuclear submarines, including remnants of the Cold War era like the Los Angeles, Ohio, and Seawolf classes, as well as the more modern Virginia-class boats, which are gradually replacing the older Los Angeles vessels. The guided missile cruiser fleet, also a product of the Cold War period, is slated for reinvestment with the introduction of a modern frigate design, as the current destroyer-heavy fleet lacks such vessels. The US Navy maintains a functional mine and countermine force, patrol vessels, and the historic 3-masted USS Constitution, the oldest active ship afloat. The Navy also operates various support ships that streamline a wide range of naval operations. So how does China fare in this category? The People's Liberation Army Navy, PLAN, has made significant advancements over the past few decades, enhancing its surface and undersea vessel capabilities and bolstering support ships. Now it's as close to US capabilities as ever before. An essential component of its power projection strategy, both regionally and globally, is the growing strength of its fixed-wing carrier fleet, currently consisting of 2 carriers. This force will soon be augmented by 2 indigenous designs, offering improved capabilities for blue water environments. The submarine fleet, which includes over 70 boats from multiple classes, still has some life left in it, with only a few beginning to show signs of aging. The destroyer fleet is relatively young, with some of the oldest units not yet reaching 30 years in service, Similarly, the frigate fleet is youthful, with a few exceptions, and currently includes only 40 vessels. The PLAN places a particular emphasis on its corvette strength, boasting around 70 modern vessels in this category. The mine-countermine fleet, consisting of 8 units, is relatively old, with the youngest being 27. The offshore strength hulls are also approaching a critical stage in their service lives, with the 10 vessels being over 25 years old. The amphibious assault force has seen a revival with the introduction of modern players designed for helicopters and transport operations from ship to shore. Additionally, 24 vessels are on order, strengthening the fleet in the carrier, submarine, destroyer, and landing helicopter dock categories. Overall, the PLAN has made significant progress in enhancing its naval capabilities. Its ultimate goal is to one day challenge the United States as the world's preeminent naval power. So which navy would win? At present, the United States regards the Chinese Navy as a formidable force, capable of contesting American naval dominance in the Western Pacific Ocean during a military conflict. This marks the primary strategic challenge for the US military since the end of the Cold War. It's worth noting that this is a pivotal moment in the contemporary era of global geopolitical competition. Throughout history, naval arms races and fleet rivalries have consistently foreshadowed shifts in global leadership. The competition between the United States and China in military capabilities, particularly with their respective navies, is just one facet of the broader strategic rivalry encompassing political, diplomatic, economic, technological, and ideological dimensions. The US sees the Chinese Navy as a critical component of China's efforts to challenge the United States, the primary military power in the Pacific. Over the past 25 years, China has been actively modernizing and expanding its naval capabilities. US observers have expressed concerns and, in some cases, raised alarms about the pace of growth and development in Chinese naval shipbuilding. They scrutinize the evolving capabilities of the Chinese Navy in comparison to the US Navy, and conclude that the United States is gradually losing its edge. China's naval modernization encompasses a broad spectrum of initiatives, including the introduction of new ships, aircraft and weapons, enhancement in maintenance and logistics, the development of naval doctrine, improvements in fleet personnel quality, education and training of naval personnel, and extensive exercises. American experts have identified certain areas of weakness within the Chinese Navy, including limited compatibility with other branches of the PLA forces, anti-submarine defense capabilities, long-range maritime operations, limited supply capabilities at sea, a restricted number of overseas bases, and challenges in training a substantial number of new sailors for the crews of the new ships, particularly in the absence of relative combat experience. Chinese naval personnel are aware of these limitations and actively strive to address them. The Chinese Navy has substantial reserves beyond its primary structure, with the Chinese Coast Guard being the largest in East Asia. This force functions as the rear or coastal component of the Navy, and under a centralized mobilization system, integrates a significant number of civilian fishing vessels. In assessing the two competing navies, it's important to consider the difference in ship types. The US Navy has a greater number of heavy ships, including aircraft carriers, guided missile cruisers, and destroyers, while the Chinese Navy possesses more light ships, such as frigates and corvettes armed with guided missiles. Additionally, US surface warships are equipped with an extensive 9,000 vertical launch missile launchers, whereas the Chinese Navy has approximately 1,000. American warships are technologically advanced. All US aircraft carriers are nuclear-powered, while the first 3 Chinese aircraft carriers utilize conventional propulsion. All American submarines are nuclear-powered, while most Chinese submarines use diesel propulsion. The majority of Chinese submarines are best suited for coastal operations rather than extended ocean voyages. Anti-ship ballistic missiles are a key asset in China's naval capabilities in a potential conflict with the US. The Chinese missile forces are armed with 2 types of medium-range anti-ship ballistic missiles: the DF-21D, with a range exceeding 932 miles, and the DF-26, with a maximum range of approximately 2,485 miles. Both systems are deployed on specialized mobile launchers. Moving on, which one of these countries has the upper hand when it comes to strategic positioning? In a hypothetical scenario where the United States attempts to conquer China independently, geographical factors come to the forefront as crucial determinants of the conflict's outcome. The longer the duration of the war, the more apparent China's geographical advantages become. China's vast land border, spanning 13,954 miles with neighboring countries, poses a significant challenge to potential US efforts to enforce an economic maritime blockade. This extensive border nullifies attempts to cut off maritime access effectively. Furthermore, China boasts the world's longest navigable waterways, totaling 68,350 miles. These waterways provide rapid mobility for various goods and military forces when conventional transportation infrastructure, such as roads and railways, fall short. In times of war, they serve as crucial routes for the movement of personnel, equipment, and supplies to critical areas. Conversely, the United States faces a considerable geographical distance from China. It's like half of the world. That would stretch its supply chains significantly, seriously impacting the dynamics of the conflict. Nonetheless, one favorable factor for a potential invasion is China's lengthy coastline, extending over 9,000 miles. A lengthy coastline necessitates a substantial commitment to homeland defense, as it provides open access to deep water sources. Many nations have, therefore, developed specialized coastal patrol craft and amphibious assault forces to mitigate concentrated sea-based attacks. A lengthy coastline requires dedicated defenses, which could potentially offer the US an advantage in terms of operational flexibility. Additionally, the concentration of most of China's human and material resources near the coastline could be advantageous for the US during the initial phases of an invasion. Thus, at the beginning of the war, the geography of China will be its disadvantage, which will eventually become a tangible advantage in the event of protracted attempts to conquer it. To comprehensively analyze this scenario, it's essential to delve deeper into the economic aspects as well. The United States, once the world's largest trading nation and a primary bilateral creditor, has seen a shift in global dynamics. Presently, nearly 100 nations consider China their foremost trading partner, while the United States maintains such a relationship with only 57 countries. China's influence has grown over the past decade, marked by a substantial commitment of $1 trillion to infrastructure projects through its Belt and Road Initiative. Whereas US aid contributions have diminished, the United States wields remarkable financial clout through its extensive transnational financial institutions and the global prominence of the US dollar. The majority of foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars, with only a small portion denominated in yuan. The US remains a frontrunner in the development of pivotal technologies, including bio, nano, and information technologies, that will be pivotal in this century's economic growth, although China has been making substantial efforts to establish formidable competition. Furthermore, the United States enjoys an advantageous position in terms of energy resources. Over the past decade, the shale revolution has transformed China into a net energy exporter, while China's reliance on energy imports has increased. Maintaining access to global resources during a conflict would be a significant advantage for the US, while China may require time to diversify its supply sources. Nevertheless, relying excessively on allies during a prolonged war could be a risky proposition. The cost of materials in the US National Defense Reserve has significantly decreased since 1952 by over 95%. In contrast, China's strategic reserves hold a considerably larger quantity of critical mineral resources. For example, China's strategic stockpiles contain approximately 7,000 metric tons of cobalt, whereas the US National Defense Reserves holds just over 300 metric tons, down significantly from more than 24,000 in 1990. This may lead to an underestimation of the critical mineral reserves required for stockpiling, considering the potential duration of a US-China conflict. In the context of a short and intense war, the emphasis would likely be on replenishing ammunition, as constructing and deploying new platforms would be impractical before hostilities began. The ability to replenish resources, as demonstrated in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, holds substantial importance in such scenarios. One significant resource deficiency in China pertains to semiconductors, as the majority of these critical components are either imported or manufactured by foreign suppliers. Semiconductors, often referred to as the oil of the 21st century, serve as the foundational technology in a wide range of devices, including smartphones, satellites, and anti-missile defense systems. The intricate process of advanced chip manufacturing is among the most complex in the manufacturing industry, involving over 1,000 production stages and lasting 3 to 4 months. That's a long time for a war between such influential states. For Chinese economists, achieving semiconductor self-sufficiency is of paramount importance. China has established substantial investments in the semiconductor industry. However, it lags behind Taiwan by approximately a decade in several crucial areas. China's overarching goal is to establish what is known as a closed loop, where domestic companies would oversee every aspect of the sector, including raw materials, engineering, chip design, manufacturing, and assembly. Conversely, the United States maintains dominance in the semiconductor sector, primarily due to its leadership in research, development, and design. How clever they are. The US has largely outsourced the production of advanced chips, primarily to Taiwan. Over time, the US share of global semiconductor production has decreased significantly, from 37% in 1990 to approximately 12%. In the event of a conflict between the United States and China, Taiwan's specialization in chip manufacturing would exacerbate global challenges. If China refrains from attacking Taiwan, the United States would have a significant advantage by maintaining Taiwan as a crucial ally. If China attacks, it will be another impetus to the world financial crisis that will arise due to the war. It's also important to understand that the US and China are each other's largest trading partners. A war between them would have a huge impact on the economies of both countries and the world. Now it's time to analyze the last important factor in the war: potential allies. Here's another consideration to keep in mind when contemplating a conflict. Who are your allies? Given the current global landscape, the United States faces a challenge in concentrating all its efforts solely on China. Various hotspots around the world and unresolved conflicts necessitate US presence and influence. Resources are also allocated to support the defense capabilities of countries such as Ukraine, NATO member states, Israel, Japan, Taiwan, and others. However, it remains uncertain whether these nations would be inclined to directly engage in a conflict with China and provide military support unless they were directly threatened. Can the US really trust their allies? In contrast, China holds an advantage over its potential adversaries, as many of the US's opponents possess substantial military forces, weaponry, and access to natural resources. A protracted conflict could unpredictably escalate tensions worldwide, draining the resources of the United States and its allies, and potentially expanding into a broader and more extensive conflict. Economically, the US's allies wield significant influence, but the global financial crisis that could arise in the wake of a conflict's onset makes it challenging to predict the extent of their support. An intriguing question pertains to whether the United States has allies within China, individuals or groups dissatisfied with China's policies, such as the Uyghurs. The strength of the Chinese system during times of war, the potential for elite collusion, and the possibility of capitulation all remain uncertain. It's also difficult to anticipate the feasibility and consequences of political assassinations of leaders in both the USA and China, and how such events would alter the course of the conflict. Conversely, democratic institutions in the United States have consistently demonstrated resilience. Simultaneously, strong pacifist and isolationist movements within the US can exert pressure on the government to seek an earlier end to the conflict. Therefore, predicting the domestic and global reactions to this conflict is difficult. If, in our theoretical case, the USA would like to conquer China, then time will not play in their favor. So, can the US conquer China on its own? The answer is probably not. Despite the superiority of many types of modern weapons, the USA will not be able to do this on its own. Even in an alliance with other NATO countries, this will be difficult because of the advantages that a defending country receives and the huge resources China has to do so. Do you think this might change in the future? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Poland's military has been going through a massive transformation, possibly resulting in it becoming the next #1 military superpower in Europe, and it's making Putin's blood run cold. After centuries of domination by foreign powers, Poland freed itself from communist rule in 1989 and joined NATO a decade later. This was a critical turning point not only for NATO but for Poland itself, heralding the start of a new era in Warsaw's international relations. Long the plaything of great powers like Germany and its predecessor state Prussia, Austria, and Russia, which had partitioned its territory several times and oppressed its people in numerous, brutal ways, Poland is now on the fast track to becoming a great power itself. In the year 2023, Poland is stronger than at any point since its glory days in the 17th century, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth dominated much of Eastern Europe, and it is getting stronger still. Let's take a look at this incredible evolution. How is Poland transforming itself into a great power, and what does it mean for that country, Europe, and the world? The entrance of Poland into NATO was a major geopolitical advantage to the alliance. During the Cold War, the alliance struggled to contain the Soviet Union,
as it and its satellite states in the Warsaw Pact stretch westward all the way to central Germany. If it so desired to move further west, NATO's forces on the European continent would be outnumbered, and the communist forces could all concentrate on a narrower front in the European plain. Poland's accession to the Western Bloc completely reversed this geostrategic situation. It was now the new, post-Soviet Russian Federation that faced the geographical disadvantage, as NATO's forces could concentrate and Russia had a much broader area of the European plain to defend should war break out. Poland's accession to NATO also cut Russia off from much of the Baltic Sea, as its coastline forms part of the natural choke point with Sweden, which in 2023 also had pending NATO membership. Put simply, on land and sea, Poland's joining NATO was one of the biggest geopolitical and geostrategic disasters for Russia after the end of the Cold War. However, Poland is no mere passive player in the alliance. It does not contribute to the free rider problem in NATO that President Obama lamented in a 2016 interview with The Atlantic, and his successor President Trump repeatedly brought up in bellicose ways in order to try and get NATO members to pay more. Poland actually carries its weight in NATO's collective security. As of July 2023, it has spent 2.42% of its GDP on defense, well above the 2% benchmark that the alliance considers its standard. This makes Poland NATO's third largest defense spender by GDP, after Greece at 3.76% and the United States at 3.47%. Poland increased its defense spending from just under the 2% benchmark in 2014 to the current 2.42% over the course of a decade. Undoubtedly, this was done primarily in response to a more aggressive Russia from 2014 onward. The Poles have a long historical memory and do not want to be the subject of Russian domination ever again. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine strengthened that resolve in Warsaw. Poland's relative level of defense spending compared to Germany's estimated 2022 total of 1.44% has even prompted many American lawmakers to propose strengthening the United States military ties with Warsaw at the expense of Berlin. Some American policymakers have floated the idea of moving most of the 35,000 US military personnel in Germany further east into Poland. A 2020 reshuffling of some American troops from Germany to Poland during the twilight days of the German skeptical Trump administration was a potential preview of that process. Poland plans to do more too. It has increased its defense spending to 4% of GDP in its 2023 budget. This would have it surpass Greece and the United States as the largest per capita military spender in NATO, and put it at a level over twice that of many other longtime NATO members, such as France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. As the quantity of Poland's military spending has gone up, the quality has gone up too. It can afford to spend a hefty amount of money on top-of-the-line military equipment because Poland has enjoyed breakneck economic growth compared to the rest of Europe. It's one of the 21st century's underreported miracle stories. Indeed, since liberalization began in 1989, Poland has experienced more economic growth than the highly touted Asian tiger countries like Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. In effect, Poland has been the tiger of Europe in the post-Cold War era. Between 1989 and 2015, Poland's GDP per capita based on purchasing power more than doubled and reached 65% of the level seen in Western Europe. It was the highest absolute and relative level of wealth in that country since the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, according to the Brookings Institution. As of 2023, its GDP per capita is about $19,000. Since 1991, Poland's total nominal GDP has grown by 126.35%, with an annual average growth of 3.94%. Tellingly, Poland did not go into recession in the financial crisis of 2008-2009, unlike the larger European Union, which shrank by 4.5%. Poland's economy instead grew by 4.2% in 2008 and 2.8% in 2009. While the so-called PIGS countries Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain struggled with the debt crisis and austerity measures at the time, Poland continued ahead with its economic growth. The Polish economy shrank by 2.02% in 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it weathered the viral storm better than many other countries, and bounced back incredibly strongly with a 6.85% growth rate in 2021. All of this speaks highly of the robust and diversified economy that Poland has created in its modern, post-communist era. Poland still places modestly in an absolute ranking of the world's economies, especially compared to its NATO peers. It has the world's 21st largest economy in GDP by 2022 dollars, with a total of $688 billion. Still, the country's economic growth has been such a success story that some observers have estimated it will have a larger economy than the United Kingdom by 2030 if its current trajectory continues. Already by GDP per capita at purchasing power parity, major cities in Poland like Warsaw, Poznan, Krakow, and Wrocław are much richer than cities in the United Kingdom like Birmingham, Manchester, and Liverpool. Although Poland's total GDP per capita still significantly lags the United Kingdom at $46,000 for the Poles, the trend is their friend. Their current GDP per capita is almost 11 times higher than it was in 1990, when it was only at a level of $1,731. The days of food shortages and lack of other basic necessities that the Poles experienced under communist rule, particularly in the 1980s, are long gone. The country's prosperity can be measured in another way too. After it joined the European Union in 2004, hundreds of thousands of Poles left Poland to seek opportunity in the United Kingdom, which, as a fellow member of the European Union back then, was easy for them to do. Now the situation has turned on its head, as Poles who immigrated to Britain are now emigrating and returning home for better opportunities than the sluggish British economy can afford them. The Polish government is keen to hurry the process along. Its finance ministry has created a program called the Polish Deal, which offers a 0% income tax for the first 4 years to Polish émigrés who decide to return home. But Polish expatriates are not the only people seeking a better life there. The situation has reversed so much that many British and other Western European expatriates are moving into Poland, often commenting highly about the good standard of living and economic opportunity there for an affordable price. Poland's economy has become a hotbed for technological innovation and manufacturing, and it has one of the most highly educated workforces in Europe, with about 1 in 2 young Poles having achieved a post-secondary education. Foreign tech companies like Google and Microsoft are opening data centers in Poland. Meanwhile, the Swedish battery manufacturer Northvolt completed its construction of its factory in Poland in May 2023. It's the largest factory for energy storage systems in Europe. Poland also has 115 aerospace companies working in what is known as its Aviation Valley, an area in the southeast of the country that has a high number of pilot training centers and industrial and scientific research facilities. About 35,000 people are employed there, among 180 different members that do about 3.5 billion euros in sales, according to the Aviation Valley Association. The association's long-term objective is to make its area one of Europe's leading aerospace regions. Poland's post-communist financial success is all the more remarkable when one considers that its population is declining, despite the huge economic growth. Its fertility rate is only about 1.4 births per woman, well below the 2.1 needed for population replacement. By the end of the century, demographers estimate that Poland will have a population of about 23 million people, only a little more than half what it is today. With this in mind, it is possible that Poland's leaders believe they need to build a top-of-the-line military now, while their country's population and economy is at a high point. Either way, the wealth generated by its economic growth has allowed Poland to increase the quality and quantity of its military. It plans to double the size of its standing army to a total of 300,000 troops by 2035. It is also investing heavily in a modern, technological, and capital-rich military, with some of the world's most advanced weapons systems. As part of this process, Poland has deepened ties with the United States and South Korea in particular. First, Poland is creating a modern air fleet based on the 5th-generation F-35 Lightning II fighter jet. Its initial order is for 32 of these planes. Meanwhile, Poland plans to rid itself of older Soviet-era planes like the 4th-generation MiG-29, which it is often keen to donate to Ukraine for the fight against Russia. Supplementing the F-35 is an order of 48 South Korean Fa-50 planes, the first 10 of which were delivered in July 2023. The Fa-50 is a light combat aircraft introduced in 2005. The jet is capable of supersonic flight and performing air-to-air or air-to-ground missions. Just as importantly, the Fa-50 is one of the world's few supersonic training aircraft, making it an ideal choice to train Polish pilots to operate the F-35. 96 American AH-54 Apache attack helicopters are also on the menu for the Poles. Poland is modernizing its tank and armored forces too. It intends to buy 116 American M1A1 Abrams tanks
and 250 of the newer M1A2 Abrams tanks. Warsaw plans to supplement this force with 1,000 South Korean K2 main battle tanks. This is in addition to its own force of 1,000 Polish-made Borsuk infantry fighting vehicles. Meanwhile, Poland is steadily donating the Soviet-era T-72 tanks in its arsenal to Ukraine. For the Poles, these old systems are no longer desirable. Poland is modernizing its artillery forces as well. The government in Warsaw is spending $10 billion on the American HIMARS rocket artillery system, which proved so devastating to Russian forces in Ukraine in 2022. It has purchased 18 HIMARS systems as of March 2023, spending $414 million on this platform. And this is just the beginning. Poland plans to buy a total of 500 HIMARS systems from the United States, which will include 45 ATACMS missiles, as part of a $10 billion deal. Considering how much damage only 16 or so HIMARS systems did to Russia in Ukraine in the late summer and autumn offensives in the Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts in 2022, without the long-range ATACMS missiles, this would be a formidable force for the Poles indeed. Supplementing HIMARS are 288 South Korean Chunmoo multiple rocket launch systems. The Poles desire modern tube artillery systems as well. As part of this effort, they are in the process of purchasing South Korean K9A1 self-propelled howitzers. These systems have a range of 34 miles. 600 of these platforms are now in the country. More are likely to come. Poland is also buying about $5 billion worth of Patriot air defense missiles from the United States and is spending $2.4 billion for British CAM air defense missiles. Russian air and drone strikes against Ukrainian cities and civilian infrastructure undoubtedly set off alarm bells among government officials in Warsaw. Poland is creating a modern air defense network to ensure the same does not happen to its cities. Poland's military buildup in size and technological quality is rapidly creating the most formidable fighting force on the European continent. When completed, the 300,000-man standing army will be the largest in Europe by number of boots on the ground. In size, readiness, and technological capability, Poland is set to become the most militarily powerful it's been since its golden age in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of the 17th century, which the Poles will remember fondly. The Commonwealth routinely defeated Russian forces. In fact, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth defeated Russia in the early 17th century and even occupied Moscow, something that Napoleon and Hitler failed to do, and only accomplished by one other fighting force, the Mongols. For a little while, the Poles and their Russian boyar collaborators installed the son King Sigismund III of Poland as the Russian Tsar. This episode was in many ways the height of the Commonwealth's power, but a century later, the tide would turn completely, and Poland would cease to exist as a state. Poland's new military is a source of pride, a signal that the bad times of partition, occupation, and communism have finally been banished, and Poland is retaking its place among the great powers of Europe. For the Poles, the 21st century military buildup and change in their country's status is not only a matter of pride, it is partially a matter of necessity, and for current, not just historical reasons. Poland shares a border with the heavily fortified and nuclear-armed Russian enclave of Kaliningrad in the north. Russian figures show that about 100,000 troops are stationed in this tight area, but Western experts believe the number might be twice that. Kaliningrad is also home to Russia's Baltic Fleet. Furthermore, Kaliningrad's presence along the borders of Poland and Lithuania creates a rare weakness in NATO's geostrategic position. This weakness is known as the Suwalki Gap, the 40-mile corridor across the Polish-Lithuanian border that separates Kaliningrad with Russia's vassal state, Belarus. A pincer offensive eastward from Kaliningrad and westward from Belarus threatens to cut the three Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, off from Poland and the rest of NATO by land. Poland would see heavy fighting in such an operation. Meanwhile, Kaliningrad is only about 240 miles north of Warsaw. With such densely concentrated forces in the enclave, a strong military capable of meeting a potential Russian offensive from its westernmost bastion is a matter of national survival. It presents a demand for increased spending that NATO states further to the west simply do not have. In effect, those countries can afford to be the free riders President Obama complained about. Poland does not have that luxury. Its territory is one that would be wrecked if a broader war were to ever break out in Europe again. Germany presents an additional demand on Poland to increase its military readiness. For historical reasons, Poland was uneasy with the comparatively warm relationship Germany shared with Russia
prior to the invasion of Ukraine. This situation came partially as a result of the former's heavy dependency on Russian oil and natural gas. The Nord Stream pipeline across the Baltic from Russian to German territory was perhaps the best example of this chummy relationship. Undoubtedly, Germany and Russia's flirtation called to mind the Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939 that partitioned Poland between them, among some policymakers in Warsaw. Poland's military expansion is a way to put pressure on the Germans to pay their fair share of NATO's defense and to remember who their true ally in the 21st century is. For now, the move seems to be paying off, as Germany has declared it will increase its defense spending to the NATO benchmark 2% of GDP in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There are many skeptics who say they have heard this from Berlin many times before, however. Warsaw probably has a disproportionate amount of them. Poland has also been a leading provider of military aid to Ukraine, with 2.48 billion euros worth. This is far behind countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, but Poland's aid is the third largest of any individual country in Europe and disproportionate to its GDP. In contrast, the EU institutions have mostly provided financial aid rather than military. Ukraine's defense is a necessity for Poland. The last thing the Poles want is for Russia to get even closer to their border. Russia's aims in Ukraine are antithetical to Poland's very existence. For the United States, Poland's rise to a military great power on the European continent is a most welcome development, to the point that Washington is even willing to lend a hand in the process. In 2022, the United States Congress approved a $288.6 million military financial package to Poland to speed its arms buildup along. The stated purpose was to deter and defend against further Russian aggression in Europe. The aid mutually benefits both countries. For Washington, containing Beijing's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific region is now the #1 foreign policy priority, even with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With Europe now only a secondary theater in the United States' geopolitical strategy, Poland's military buildup is a much welcome boost for America's goals, as it will reduce the European defense burden, which has been so disproportionately carried by the superpower across the Atlantic since World War II. The American help is welcome for Warsaw too. Poland's military spending comes at a high price tag, about 85 billion euros worth on new weapons by 2030, and with risks to come at the expense of civilian projects. Inflation in Poland is also running high at 17%, and economic growth, though still high, is slowing. There is a risk of resource strain with such high levels of military spending. However, the leadership in Warsaw believes that the price of the arms buildup is affordable and of secondary concern. Jarosław Kaczynski, the chairman of Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party, summed up the mentality behind this expansion in military spending in early 2023 when he said, "It is better to be in debt, and even to have to make cuts to budgets in other areas, than to be occupied. Whoever has seen what is happening in Ukraine should have no doubt about this." Kaczynski, a former Polish prime minister, is considered one of Warsaw's leading power brokers. He was born in 1949 and remembers the bad old days, where he was an active member in anti-communist circles in Poland. He and other politicians of his generation understand what is at stake and what needs to be protected. For them, Poland's ascendancy to a militarily great power is not only a matter of pride, but one of survival. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its numerous and varied war crimes there stirred both recent and deep historical demons in Warsaw. The response has been to build a first-rate military that will soon be without peer on the European continent, if all goes according to plan. But will it? What do you think? Tell us your opinions on Poland's economic rise and military buildup, and what it means for European and world politics. And don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.